The grandfather clock in the south corridor of the Vance estate did not chime on the hour anymore. Its internal brass weights had slipped 3 winters ago, and nobody but Arthur had noticed. Instead, it produced a dry, rhythmic click every 60 seconds, a tiny throat clearing that only echoed when the limestone floors were empty. It was 5:14 a.m. Arthur sat at the mahogany desk in the family's private study, the only room in the north wing that remained cold even when the central boiler was active. Before him lay 3 separate leather-bound ledgers, their spines darkened by generations of damp Berkshire air and the oils of his own fingers. He did not use a computer for the initial reconciliation. His father, Charles, believed that digital spreadsheets invited informal thinking, a phrase he used to dismiss anything he could not physically throw across a room. Arthur dipped a microfiber cloth into a shallow tin of saddle soap, the sharp, waxy smell of glycerin and neatsfoot oil rising to meet the chill in the air. He worked the grease into the dry edges of a vintage calfskin ledger containing the agricultural tax exemptions for the family's equestrian park in Wellington. The leather was stiff, resisting the moisture, much like the soil of the estate itself. Outside the tall sash windows, the morning fog clung to the white paddock fences, thick and smelling faintly of marsh water and wet pine. In the distance, the muffled, rhythmic thud of a horse being lunged in the indoor arena drifted through the glass. Julian was likely still asleep in the guest cottage, his imported leather boots drying by the hearth after some late-night trail ride he hadn't authorized, but the stable hands were already moving. They worked on Arthur's schedule, not Julian's. A floorboard creaked in the hall. It wasn't the heavy, deliberate heel strike of Charles, but the lighter, dragging step of Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper of 32 years. She entered without knocking, carrying a silver tray. On it sat a single cup of black coffee, the steam rising in a thin, straight line before being sheared away by the draft from the window. "Your father asked for the quarterly distributions for the stable staff to be placed on his sideboard before breakfast," she said. Her voice was flat, dried out by decades of old money politeness. She did not look at Arthur's face. Her eyes remained fixed on the corner of the desk, where 3 unfiled invoices from a veterinary clinic in Wellington sat under a brass paperweight. "They were completed yesterday, Mrs. Gable," Arthur said, his voice quiet, adjusted to the hushed acoustics of a house that treated loud voices as a middle-class vulgarity. "I placed them in his leather folio, the red one. He said he couldn't find them." She adjusted the silver tray under her arm. "He was quite specific. He said you must have forgotten." Arthur looked at the stack of veterinary invoices. One of them was for an experimental tendon therapy on a stallion Julian had purchased in Argentina 6 months ago, a horse that had yet to place in a single regional show but had already cost $42,000 in specialized feed and orthopedic shoes. The invoice was 3 weeks past due. The clinic had threatened a quiet, polite lien on the animal. Arthur reached into his desk drawer, pulled out the carbon copy of the distribution list he had personally signed and stamped at 10 p.m. the previous evening, and slid it across the mahogany. "The red folio was on his desk, behind the decanter," Arthur murmured. "I'll ensure he has another copy." Mrs. Gable took the paper without a thank you. Her fingers, spotted with liver stains, were dry and rough as they brushed the vellum. She turned and left, her soft-soled shoes squeaking once on the parquet floor, where the wax had worn thin near the door. Arthur watched the doorframe long after she had gone. The espresso machine in the small butler's pantry behind the study gave a sudden metallic hiss as its boiler cycled off. It was a high-end Italian unit Julian had insisted on importing 3 summers ago, claiming the estate's kitchen coffee tasted like wet charcoal. Julian had used it twice before leaving the steam wand coated in dried milk, which Arthur had spent 40 minutes scraping off with a razor blade. Since then, only Arthur used it, though he always wiped the chrome until it showed nothing but his own hollow reflection. His phone buzzed on the blotter. It was a text message from his brother. "Julian, tell Miguel to prep the bay mare for 10. Father wants to watch her walk the poles. Also, need 5,000 petty cash moved to the barn ledger for the farrier. He doesn't take wire transfers anymore." Arthur stared at the screen. The farrier, a third-generation craftsman named Thomas who had shoed every Vance horse since the late 70s, absolutely took wire transfers. He preferred them. What Thomas did not do was accept late payments, and Julian's personal account was currently overdrawn by $7,000 due to an unspecified dispute with a yacht charter company in Nassau. The petty cash was Julian's way of bypassing the family office's automated audit trail. Arthur's thumb hovered over the keyboard. He could explain, for the 12th time, that moving $5,000 from the estate's operating account into petty cash without a corresponding invoice would trigger a flags-up warning from the firm's compliance officer in Boston. He could point out that the bay mare had a swollen hock and shouldn't be trotting over poles, let alone walking them under a heavy saddle. He calculated the energy required. A text would lead to a phone call. The phone call would involve Julian's lazy, amused drawl, that tone of voice that suggested Arthur was being terribly middle management about trivialities. If Arthur stood his ground, Julian would complain to Charles over breakfast. Charles would look up from his poached eggs, his eyes cold behind his reading glasses, and say, "Arthur, don't be small. Your brother has a sponsor coming in from Palm Beach. Just resolve it." The energy required to defend the protocol was 72 units of mental friction. The energy required to simply reclassify the $5,000 as pasture maintenance and pay Thomas directly from the family office's secondary reserve was 12. Arthur set the phone down without replying. He pulled a fresh sheet of heavy cream-colored bond paper from the leather organizer. He picked up his fountain pen, a plain black Mont Blanc his mother had given him for his high school graduation, the only gift he had ever received from her that didn't have the family crest engraved on it. With a steady hand, he wrote out the transfer order. Invoice 8841, drainage and limestone gridding, paddock 4. He signed his initials at the bottom, AV. The ink was a deep midnight blue. It took 40 seconds to dry in the damp air of the room. As he waited, he watched the fog outside slowly lift from the grass, revealing the long, pale shadow of the indoor arena. A single figure in a wax canvas coat was leading a horse out toward the lunging ring. It wasn't Julian. It was never Julian. Arthur closed the calfskin ledger, the lock of the brass clasp clicking home with a small, clean sound that seemed to settle something in the room's cold corners. The silver letter opener was heavy, its handle cast in the shape of a dormant hound, the silver worn so thin at the muzzle that the yellowish brass beneath showed through like an old bruise. Arthur held it by the blade, sliding it beneath the thick flap of a cream envelope postmarked from Boston. Slicing. A clean, dry hiss of paper parting. It was a physical routine he had performed every Monday and Thursday morning since his 22nd birthday. First, the estate utilities. Second, the farm operational invoices. Third, the private accounts. He sorted them into 3 precise piles on the green leather blotter. The utility bills went to the left, aligned with the edge of the bronze inkwell. The farm invoices sat in the center. The private correspondence, mostly addressed to Charles or Julian, went to the right. Outside, the mist had turned into a thin, cold drizzle that streaked the tall windows, turning the white paddocks into gray, blurred bars. The copper gutters above the study window dripped in an irregular, leaden rhythm. Clink, clink, pause, clink. A sound that Arthur had mapped over 15 years. When the rain was heavy, the drip became a steady drone. When it was freezing, it stopped entirely, the ice choking the metal throat until the midday sun cracked it open. The door behind him did not swing open so much as it yielded to pressure. Charles Vance entered. At 74, his father still carried the posture of a man who spent 4 hours a day in a custom-made English saddle. He smelled of cold dampness, wet wool, and the sharp medicinal tang of the liniment he used on his arthritic left knee, masked poorly by a splash of lavender water cologne. His leather riding boots, still dark with mud around the welts, left dull, damp circles on the Persian rug as he walked. He did not look at Arthur. He went straight to the sideboard where the silver tray of cold coffee still sat, ignored. "The mare's off in her left hind," Charles said. His voice was deep, gravelly from a lifetime of shouting over wind on the turf, yet hushed by the quiet of the room. He picked up a silver spoon, tapped it twice against the rim of an empty cup, then set it down without using it. "Julian says she just needs a light turn on the soft track. He wants to bring over that trainer from New Jersey, the one who worked with the Pendleton stables." Arthur did not lift his eyes from the Boston bank statement. "The Pendleton trainer charges $800 a day, plus travel." "We aren't discussing the ledger, Arthur," Charles said, his back still turned as he stared out the window toward the gray paddocks. "We are discussing the horse. Julian thinks she has the scope for the amateur owner division in Wellington. If we don't get her right by November, we lose the season." Arthur's hand remained still on the silver letter opener. He looked at the next envelope in the stack, a tax notice from the town of Great Barrington. It was an assessment for the guest cottage where Julian had been living, rent-free, for 6 years. The town had reassessed the property's detached garage, which Julian had converted into a private gym with mirrored walls and an infrared sauna. The tax increase was $4,800. Under normal circumstances, Arthur would have quietly drafted a check from the estate's primary operating account, filed the municipal receipt under Improved Agricultural Structures, and filed the tax assessment away before Charles ever saw it. It was the kind of friction-reducing labor he did 3 times a week. It kept the household running like a clock with oiled gears. He looked at his father's reflection in the glass of the window. Charles was rubbing his left thumb over his signet ring, a habit he had when he was thinking of his own father, or of Julian. "The Pendleton trainer has a lien against him in New York," Arthur said softly, "for non-payment of feed bills at his own facility." Charles turned. His eyebrows, thick and white like tufts of sheep's wool, drew together. "Julian checked his references. He says the man is solid." "Julian checked his Instagram," Arthur said. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the dry clink of the copper gutter outside. Charles did not raise his voice. That would require acknowledging that Arthur's point had weight. Instead, he reached down and picked up the stack of private letters on the right side of the desk, his thumb smudging the cream paper of the Boston envelope. "You have a very narrow way of looking at these things, Arthur," Charles said, his voice dropping into that familiar register of disappointed patience. "Your brother has an eye for people. He understands the social side of this business. A family like ours doesn't survive on bookkeeping alone. We survive on presence. Julian has presents. He shuffled through the letters, stopping at one with the seal of the New York Yacht Club. He slid it into his coat pocket. The tax notice for the cottage, Charles added, pointing a blunt finger at the Great Barrington envelope still sitting in the center pile. Just handle it. Don't make a project out of it. Arthur looked at the envelope. He calculated the energy required to explain that the estate's primary operating account was currently light by $12,000 because Julian's quarterly club dues had been auto-drafted twice due to an administrative error Julian refused to call and correct. He calculated the effort of showing Charles the red-marked balances. He chose silence. "I'll place it with Julian's mail," Arthur said. Charles paused, his hand hovering over the desk. He looked at Arthur then, a brief, frowning squint, as if trying to read a label in a dim room. "Julian doesn't handle the municipal filings." "He lives there," Arthur said. His voice was level, completely devoid of heat or sarcasm. "The town addressed it to the resident. I've sorted it accordingly." Charles stared at him for 3 seconds. The silence stretched, cold and thin, until the grandfather clock in the hall gave its dry, metallic click. Charles let out a short, nasal sigh, the sound of a man dealing with a stubborn servant, and turned back toward the door. "Just make sure it's paid," Charles said over his shoulder. "I don't want the town clerk calling me at the club. It looks untidy." The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, the latch catching with a dull thump that vibrated through the floorboards. Arthur did not pick up the Great Barrington envelope. Instead, he took the silver letter opener and slid it into the next letter. This one was from the family's private wealth advisory firm in Boston, addressed personally to him. It was the quarterly valuation of his own small, 10% non-voting share in the Vance family holding company, the small crumb his grandfather had left him in a codicil 30 years ago, which Charles had never bothered to try and buy back because he deemed 10% of a family-controlled entity functionally useless to anyone outside the main seat. Arthur unfolded the single sheet of blue-tinted paper. The valuation of his shares was currently $7.2 million, based on the liquidated value of the real estate holdings alone. He folded the paper back into its exact creases, slid it back into the blue envelope, and placed it not in the drawer, but inside his personal leather briefcase sitting beside his feet. He then reached over, picked up the Great Barrington tax notice, and laid it precisely on top of the pile of mail marked Julian. The grain room of the main stable block smelled of crushed oats, sweet molasses, and the cold, sharp dust of dry alfalfa. It was a cavernous space with thick fieldstone walls built in the 1920s, designed to keep the summer heat out and the winter dry in. Arthur stood by the heavy oak bin, his hand buried to the wrist in a pile of imported crimped oats. He pulled a handful to the surface, letting the golden husks slip between his fingers back into the dark wood. He took a small brass probe from his coat pocket, an old tool with a dial that measured grain moisture, and inserted it deep into the center of the bin. 12.2%. Safe. If the moisture rose to 14, the grain would sweat in the tight bins, and within 3 weeks, mold would begin to bloom, invisible to the eye, but toxic enough to colic $100,000 warm blood. Julian never checked the moisture. Julian simply assumed that because the feed was delivered in bags with gilded lettering from a mill in Vermont, it was perfect. The double doors of the barn creaked open, admitting a gust of damp wind and the wet, heavy smell of horse manure from the paddocks. Miguel entered, his boots caked with gray clay. He was a small, wiry man of 50, wearing a faded canvas jacket with a tear at the shoulder that had been patched with black duct tape. He took off his wool cap, revealing hair that had gone almost entirely silver since the previous winter. "Arthur," Miguel said, stopping by the edge of the grain scale. He didn't look Arthur in the eye. Instead, his gaze drifted to the brass probe in Arthur's hand. The delivery from Rotterdam arrived, the specialized supplement for the bay mare. The German pellets, Arthur said. Yes, 3 pallets. They're sitting on the flatbed in the driveway. Miguel rubbed his palms together, the rough skin scraping like sandpaper. The driver won't unload them. He says the bill of lading requires a certified bank draft on delivery, $7,400. Arthur wiped the brass probe with a clean rag and slid it back into his pocket. He did not look up from the grain bin. The corporate office in Boston issued a purchase order last month. The driver says the purchase order was declined by the credit department, Miguel murmured. He shifted his weight from one muddy boot to the other, his eyes tracing the grain of the floorboards. He says the account has a temporary hold, something about an unresolved balance on the estate's commercial credit line. Arthur knew exactly what the unresolved balance was. 2 weeks ago, Julian had rented 3 VIP luxury suites at the Boston Garden for an exhibition match, charging the hospitality expenses directly to the Equestrian Division's commercial credit line. The billing department in Boston had automatically flagged the expense as non-operational, freezing the line until a manual reconciliation could be performed. Arthur could clear the hold with a single phone call to the bank manager, who had known him for 12 years. He could transfer the funds from the estate's timberland management account to cover the deficit within 10 minutes. He looked at the small pile of oats remaining in his palm, then blew them gently back into the bin. "Tell the driver to take the pallets back to the depot," Arthur said. Miguel's head snapped up, his brow furrowing. "But the mare, Julian said she has to start the supplement today. He said if she misses a day of the loading dose, her joints won't hold up for the trot-up on Thursday." The stable operating fund cannot issue a certified draft without an approved invoice signed by the managing partner, Arthur said. His voice was flat, carrying the calm, mechanical weight of a bank statement. "My father is the managing partner. He is currently at lunch at the club." "Can't you sign for it, Arthur?" Miguel's voice was barely a whisper, strained with the anxiety of a man who knew he would be the one caught between Julian's temper and Charles's cold indifference. "You've always signed before. The bank always takes your signature." Arthur took a clean piece of chalk from the ledge above the grain bin. He turned to the slate board mounted on the wall, where the daily feed rations for the 28 horses in training were listed in his own neat block print. He found the section marked Vance's Legacy, the bay mare Julian had bought. "The mare's feed ration remains at 4 quarts of the standard crimped oats and 2 flakes of Timothy," Arthur said, his chalk dryly scraping the slate as he drew a thin white line through the word supplement. "If the German pellets are not unloaded, we do not feed them." "Julian will be furious," Miguel said. He didn't move. He stood with his cap in both hands, squeezing the wool until his knuckles turned white. "He told me this morning that if the mare isn't ready for the New Jersey trainer on Thursday, it's my job on the line. He said he'd have the stable swept out by Friday." Arthur finished the line on the slate. He set the chalk down, then turned to face Miguel. He looked at the torn duct tape patch on the stable manager's jacket. "My father signed your employment contract, Miguel," Arthur said softly. "Not Julian. Under Section 9 of the estate bylaws, only the managing partner can terminate permanent staff." "But your father does whatever Julian asks him to," Miguel muttered, finally looking Arthur in the eye, his expression a mixture of fear and quiet desperation. "You know how it is. If Julian makes enough noise, your father he signs whatever is put in front of him to make the noise stop." Arthur felt the familiar, cold calculation click into place behind his eyes. He could intervene. He could protect Miguel as he had protected him 4 times over the past 3 years when Julian had blamed the stable staff for his own poor riding or forgotten entries. He could spend his afternoon drafting a protective employment memorandum, getting his father to sign it between his second and third scotch at the club, and then calling the shipping depot to personally guarantee the freight charges. The cost of that intervention would be 4 hours of his life, a conversation with a drunk father, and the continuation of Julian's belief that money simply fell from the sky like rain on the pasture. "If Julian wishes to terminate your contract," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a low, steady cadence, "he will have to draft the termination papers himself and present them to the family office. I will ensure they are filed in accordance with state labor laws." Miguel stared at him, his mouth slightly open. He had worked for the Vances long enough to know the subtext. He knew that Julian didn't even know where the termination forms were kept, let alone how to fill them out without 3 spelling errors. "So, I tell the driver to go?" Miguel asked. "Yes," Arthur said. "Tell him the delivery is refused due to lack of authorized payment." Miguel stood still for a moment longer, the cold draft from the door whistling through the gap in the stone wall behind him. Then, with a slow, heavy nod, he turned and walked back out into the gray drizzle, leaving the heavy oak doors to creak shut behind him. Arthur stood in the quiet of the grain room. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, pocket-sized notebook, and turned to a page marked Operational Withdrawals. Under today's date, he wrote, "Refused delivery, German feed supplement. Saving, $7,400. Demurrage risk, $150 per day, chargeable to Julian's personal ledger." He closed the notebook. The sound of a heavy truck engine revving in the gravel driveway drifted through the stone walls, followed by the wet crunch of tires as the flatbed turned around to leave. The slate hearth in the library was wide enough to roast a yearling, built from dark, fossil-patterned stone hauled from a quarry in Vermont when the house was framed in 1911. Arthur knelt on a wool kneeling mat, his trousers rolled up twice at the ankle to keep them clear of the cold hearth floor. Scrape. He drew the flat iron spade across the stone, collecting the gray, powdery ash from the previous night's birch fire. The dust rose in silent, lazy plumes, settling on the backs of his hands and the dark wool of his sweater. It smelled of dry carbon, cold charcoal, and the faint, sweet trace of caramelized sap. He emptied the spade into a small, double-walled tin bucket. The clink of the metal shovel against the tin was the only sound in the room, save for the low, rhythmic rattle of the wind against the leaded glass panes. Arthur did not use gloves. He preferred the dry, alkaline grease of the soot on his skin. It was a physical reminder of what it took to keep the hearth clean before his father down came at 7 to read the evening papers. The double oak doors of the library vibrated, then swung inward with a heavy draft of cold air. Julian walked in, his long canvas riding coat open, his tall brown boots dripping gray water onto the polished, wide-plank oak floor. He was typing rapidly on his phone, the screen casting a pale, bluish glare over his sharp jawline and the silver-trimmed collar of his shirt. He didn't look up as he crossed the room, his boots leaving dark, wet prints that immediately began to soak into the wood. "It's an absolute circus," Julian said to the room at large. His voice was high, thin, and carried that familiar edge of petulant exhaustion that usually preceded a request for a wire transfer. "The freight company is claiming they don't have a record of the commercial account override. I've been on the phone with some clerk in Newark for 40 minutes who doesn't even know what Wellington is." Arthur did not look up from his spade. He reached for a wire brush, using it to scrub the soot from the cast-iron fireback, the heavy plate marked with the Vance family crest, a rearing horse under a broken lance, now mostly obscured by layers of carbon. "The driver said the delivery was refused," Julian continued, tossing his phone onto the leather sofa. He threw himself down next to it, his head falling back against the mahogany-trimmed leather cushions. Miguel says you told him to send them back. Arthur, the mare has to be on that supplement by tomorrow morning. If she isn't, the New Jersey trainer is going to look at her hock and tell me we're wasting our time. The commercial credit line was frozen by the Boston office, Arthur said. His voice was low, rhythmic, matching the steady sweep of his wire brush against the iron. They require a physical signature from the managing partner to release the holds when they exceed $5,000. Then go get Father's signature, Julian said, his eyes closed as he massaged the bridge of his nose. He's in the billiard room with Harrison. Just take the form in there and have him sign it. It takes 2 seconds. Arthur stopped brushing. He looked at the family crest on the iron plate. The horse's head was completely black, buried under a decade of unscrubbed soot that he was only now beginning to clear away. He made the calculation. To go to the billiard room would require interrupting Charles while he was with Harrison, the family's chief investment trustee. Charles detested being interrupted during his evening whiskey, especially by Arthur carrying administrative clutter. If Arthur went, Charles would scowl, sign the paper without looking, and later tell Julian that Arthur was losing his grip on the domestic office because he couldn't handle a simple freight delivery without supervision. Conversely, if he did nothing, the Devon Horse Show entries, which required the same frozen credit line to process before the midnight deadline, would be rejected. The entry fees were $3,400. The stabling fee was another $1,200. If Julian missed the entry deadline, he would not be able to show the mare at Devon. The mare would remain in her paddock, her hock would heal naturally through rest rather than expensive, temporary steroid loading, and the estate would save nearly $10,000 in travel and trainer expenses. The Boston office closed at 5, Arthur said. Julian opened one eye, squinting through the dim library light. So, you have the emergency override portal on your laptop. You can just log in as the trustee assistant and push it through. You've done it before when the payroll was late. The portal requires a 2-factor authorization code, Arthur murmured, his wire brush resuming its slow, steady scrape. Scrape, scrape. The token is linked to the physical key fob on Father's desk in the master suite. The master suite is locked while the housekeepers are turning down the beds. Julian let out a sharp, irritated breath, turning his head away to look at the dark ceiling. This is exactly what I mean. You build these massive, bureaucratic walls around everything, Arthur. It's a horse. It's 5 bags of feed. We aren't buying a bank. Arthur didn't reply. He swept the loosened soot into the center of the hearth, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He took a handful of crumpled newspaper, old copies of the Financial Times that Charles had already read and discarded, and laid them on the cold stone. On top of the paper, he built a small teepee of dry cedar kindling, each piece no thicker than a pencil. I need to wire the Devon entry fee tonight, Julian said, his voice dropping into a quiet, flat drone. He was staring at his phone again, his thumb scrolling through an email. The secretary at the show office sent me a reminder. If the payment doesn't clear by midnight, they give our stable slots to the wait list. There are 82 people on the wait list, Arthur. Then you should use your personal account, Arthur said. My personal account is... There's a hold on it, Julian muttered, his voice dropping even lower, his eyes remaining fixed on the screen. Some administrative mess with the yacht broker. It won't clear until Friday. Arthur laid a heavy birch log across the kindling. The bark was silver and peeling, dry as parchment. Then you'll have to wait until Friday, Arthur said. Julian sat up, his boots clicking sharply against each other as his legs came together. You're serious? You're just going to let the Devon entries go? Father has had a box at Devon since 1984, Arthur. If we don't have a horse in the main class, people are going to ask questions. They'll think we're having liquidity issues." "We are having liquidity issues," Arthur said softly. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a long wooden match, and struck it against the rough slate of the hearth. The yellow flame flared instantly, illuminating the gray dust on his knuckles and the clean, pale skin of his wrists. He held the match to the edge of the crumpled newspaper. The paper caught with a dry, rushing sizzle. The small flame licked up through the cedar kindling, the wood popping once, twice, as the resin heated. Julian watched the fire, his face half shadowed by the growing glow. He looked annoyed, but it was the annoyance of a passenger whose train was delayed by 15 minutes, not a man who realized the tracks ahead had been removed. He stood up, grabbing his phone from the sofa, and shook his coat back into place. "I'll talk to Father at dinner," Julian said, turning toward the door. "He'll make you clear the line. This is just ridiculous." He walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar. Arthur knelt by the hearth for another 3 minutes, watching the flames wrap around the birch log. The bark blackened, curling back like old paper, before catching fire with a bright, hot hiss. He took his phone from his pocket. The screen showed 3 missed calls from the Boston office's senior compliance manager. Arthur did not call them back. He set the phone face down on the wool kneeling mat, took the brass bellows, and began to blow a steady, slow stream of air into the base of the fire, watching the embers glow a deep, suffocating red. The dining room table was a single 20-foot slab of Honduran mahogany, imported by Arthur's great-grandfather in 1924. It was polished twice a year with a mixture of beeswax and turpentine until the surface was so dark and reflective that the silver candelabra seemed to float on a pool of black water. Arthur moved around the perimeter of the table, a soft chamois cloth gripped in his right palm. Swirl, polish, press. He wiped away the faint, misty rings left by the crystal water goblets. The wood was cold under his hand, retaining none of the warmth of the 3 people who had sat at one end of it 90 minutes ago. The dinner had been a silent affair, marked only by the heavy, metallic clink of silver against porcelain and the dry, rhythmic scraping of Charles's knife against his roast lamb. Julian had spent the meal staring at his phone, his fork untouched, while Charles had consumed his meat with the slow, deliberate aggression of an old predator. On the sideboard, next to a half-empty decanter of port, sat a small, square slip of heavy, cream-colored memo paper. Arthur stopped polishing. He walked over to the sideboard, the chamois cloth draped over his shoulder like a servant's towel. He picked up the paper. In the center of the sheet, written in Charles's thick, arrogant hand, using a broad-nibbed fountain pen that left pools of ink at the turns, were 3 lines. "Arthur, clear the Boston line immediately. Julian's Devon entry must go through tonight. C.V." The ink was dry, but the paper still smelled faintly of Charles's lavender water cologne. He had left it there on his way to the billiard room, not even bothering to hand it to Arthur directly, assuming the slip of paper would act as an automated command, processed by the invisible machinery of the house while he slept. Arthur turned the paper over. On the back, there was a small smudge of mutton grease from his father's thumb. He looked at the grandfather clock in the hall. The face was dark, but the brass hands, illuminated by the low security lights of the corridor, showed 11:22 p.m. 38 minutes remained before the Devon Horse Show's online entry portal locked for the season. Arthur's phone sat in his pocket, a light weight against his thigh. He knew the sequence by heart. He could open the administrative portal on his screen, scan the signature on the memo using the phone's camera, upload it to the Boston office's automated overnight clearing queue, and trigger the emergency override. The system would recognize Charles's signature profile, verify the authorized user, and release the commercial credit line within 4 minutes. The Devon payment would clear at 11:30 p.m. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He did not open the portal. Instead, he opened his email inbox. There was a single automated notification from the estate's primary capital account. It was a low balance warning. The account had dipped below $50,000 for the first time in 9 years, largely due to the 6-figure deposit Julian had authorized for a custom-built horse van that was currently sitting in a port in Baltimore, awaiting import duty clearance. If the Devon entry fee of $4,600 cleared tonight, the account would drop to $43,000. On Wednesday, the quarterly property taxes for the main estate grounds, $68,000, were scheduled for automated withdrawal. If the commercial line remained frozen, the Devon fee would fail, but the tax payment would clear on Wednesday without triggering a massive overdraft fee or a formal notice of delinquency from the State Revenue Department. Arthur made the calculation. The energy required to clear the line, process the entry, and then manually shuffle $80,000 from the timberland reserve to cover the Wednesday tax withdrawal was 96 units of logistical effort. It would require 3 phone calls tomorrow morning, 2 transfer authorizations, and a long explanation to the trustee in Boston about why the timber reserve was being depleted for operational expenses. The energy required to let the Devon entry fail, let the tax payment clear naturally, and then file Charles's signed memo in the pending reconciliation folder tomorrow morning was 4. He chose 4. Arthur folded the cream-colored slip of paper in half, then in half again, until the mutton grease smudge was buried inside the crease. He slid it into the breast pocket of his shirt behind his pen. He picked up the half-empty decanter of port. The glass was heavy, cut with deep, diamond-patterned grooves that caught the dim light of the chandelier. He pressed the heavy glass stopper back into the neck of the decanter, the glass-on-glass contact making a sharp, dry clink that seemed to linger in the empty room. He carried the decanter to the silver-lined liquor cabinet in the corner of the room, placed it on the lower shelf, and turned the key in the brass lock. The lock was old, its tumblers worn down by 70 years of use. It didn't snap shut. It gave a soft, scraping sigh as the brass tongue slid into the frame. He removed the key, feeling the cold metal against his palm, and slid it into his pocket alongside his phone. "Arthur?" Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway of the butler's pantry, her apron already removed, wearing a heavy wool coat that smelled of damp wool and mothballs. She had her car keys in her hand, the brass ring jingling softly as she stood in the shadows. "The kitchen is closed," she said. "The roast is in the larder. I left the bone for the dogs, as your father asked." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Arthur said. "Go home. The roads will be slick by the creek." She lingered for a second, her eyes wandering over the long, dark expanse of the mahogany table, stopping at the chamois cloth draped over Arthur's shoulder. "Is the Boston business settled?" she asked, her voice dropping into that quiet, cautious tone she used when she was trying to gauge the temperature of the house. Julian was very loud on the stairs after dinner. "It's being processed," Arthur said. His voice was level, completely free of tension. "Good night, Mrs. Gable." She looked at him for another moment, her old eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to find some crack in his composure. Finding none, she gave a small, stiff nod and turned back into the pantry. A moment later, the heavy fire door at the back of the kitchen creaked open, then closed with a dull hydraulic hiss. Arthur stood alone in the dining room. The silence of the house settled back down around him, thick and cold. He walked to the window and looked out into the darkness. The rain had stopped, but the temperature had dropped below freezing. The wet gravel of the driveway was already turning into a sheet of black ice, reflecting the pale security lights of the main gate like a long, dark mirror. He took his phone from his pocket. The digital clock on the screen read 11:58 p.m. He opened his personal email. There was a notification from his private broker. His personal liquid capital account, completely separate from the Vance family office, had just completed its monthly settlement. The balance was $942,000. Liquid, mobile, entirely his. He closed the screen. In the distance, down the long corridor of the north wing, the grandfather clock gave its dry, mechanical click as the minute hand reached 12. The Devon entry portal was closed. Arthur turned off the chandelier. The room vanished into the blackness of the Berkshire night, leaving only the faint, cold scent of beeswax and turpentine in the dark. The bone folder was carved from a single piece of ox bone, yellowed at the tip from 30 years of friction against heavy linen cardstock. Arthur held it at a 15-degree angle, drawing the polished edge down the seam of a payroll envelope. Crease, press, slide. The paper folded with a clean, crisp snap. He laid the finished envelope on the pile to his left, next to the small brass dish containing a damp sponge. He didn't lick the adhesive. The bitter, chemical taste of the glue lingered in the mouth for hours, and Arthur preferred his morning tea to taste only of bergamot and iron water. The radiator beneath the window gave a sharp, metallic clink-clack as the steam pressure rose. The old pipes behind the wainscoting hummed, a low vibration that Arthur felt in the soles of his shoes. Outside, the morning sun was thin and pale, a white disk struggling through a bank of yellow fog that rose from the creek bed. The door to the office didn't open. It was thrown back until the brass knob struck the plaster wall with a dull, hollow thud. Julian stood in the doorway. He was still in his silk dressing gown, the dark green one with the gold piping that Charles had bought him in London, and his leather slippers were unbuckled, dragging against the floorboards. His hair was damp and uncombed, and his face had the pale, bloated look of a man who had been awake since 4 a.m., arguing with people 3 time zones away. "Why didn't you clear the line?" Julian's voice was high, thin, and cracked slightly at the end. He did not enter the room. He remained on the threshold, holding his phone in both hands as if it were a broken tool he was trying to force back together. The Devon registrar sent an automated rejection at midnight. By 12:05 our slots were gone. The stable manager from the Maryland group has already taken our stalls. Arthur did not stop his hand. He took another envelope, aligned the flap with the baseline, and drew the bone folder down the seam. Crease, press, slide. "The Boston office was closed, Julian," Arthur said. His voice was quiet, matching the steady hum of the radiator. "You had the token," Julian said, taking 2 steps into the office, his slippers scuffing the Persian rug. "Father told me he left the signed memo on the sideboard. He said he saw you pick it up before you turned off the lights. You had his signature. You could have run the override." Arthur laid the folder down. He picked up the damp brass sponge, ran it lightly along the adhesive strip of the envelope, and folded the flap down. He did not look at his brother. His eyes remained on the small, black-inked name printed on the front of the envelope. Miguel Santos, Stable Operations. "The override system requires a verified invoice to match the capital transfer," Arthur said. "Your Devon entry fee was not billed as an operational invoice. It was billed as a personal hospitality expense through your LLC. The automated compliance script in Boston flagged it. A signed memo from father cannot override state tax compliance laws on personal distribution limits. That is complete rubbish, and you know it, Julian spat, his fingers tightening around his phone. We've run the Devon fees through the farm ledger for 10 years. Nobody in Boston has ever said a word. The Boston office was restructured in January, Julian, Arthur said softly. The new compliance officer is a former auditor from the Massachusetts Revenue Authority. He does not recognize custom and practice as a substitute for documentation. Then call him, Julian said, his voice rising. Call him right now. Tell him it was a clerical error. Tell him to reverse the flag and wire the show committee directly. Eleanor is still at the secretary's office. I know she is. She's checking the horses in. Arthur turned his head slightly, his gaze finally resting on his brother's face. Julian's skin was sallow in the morning light, his eyes bloodshot. There was a tiny fleck of dried white toothpaste at the corner of his mouth, a detail that made him look less like an international equestrian and more like a child who had been dressed too quickly. Arthur calculated the energy required to make the call. The compliance officer in Boston was named Miller. He was 38, wore cheap suits, and had spent the last 3 months trying to find a single, solid thread of financial negligence in the Vance family accounts that would justify his salary. If Arthur called him to demand a 6-digit credit release for a horse show, Miller would immediately request a full ledger audit of the equestrian division's promotional expenses, including Julian's travel receipts from Wellington and Palm Beach. An audit would take 4 weeks. It would reveal that $62,000 of stable maintenance had actually paid for Julian's private villa rental during the Winter Equestrian Festival. The energy to argue with Miller, hide the villa receipts, and placate the Boston trustees was 98. The energy to let Julian miss the show and deal with his anger for 48 hours was 15. Eleanor does not accept late entries after the waitlist has been notified, Arthur said. It's against the committee bylaws. You know Eleanor's husband, Julian said, his voice dropping into a desperate, cajoling register. He leaned against the corner of Arthur's desk, his silk gown brushing the pile of finished envelopes. You sat on the land trust board with him last year. If you call him, Arthur, just a quick call. Tell him we'll sponsor the patrons' tent for the autumn trials. He'll get Eleanor to slip us back in. He owes you that favor from the easement dispute. Arthur looked at the corner of his desk where Julian was leaning. A faint, wet circle from Julian's damp gown was beginning to raise the grain of the mahogany. That favor was spent, Arthur said. Julian froze, his brow furrowing. Spent on what? On the zoning variants for the new indoor arena, Arthur said, his voice smooth and empty as polished stone. The one you insisted we build so the horses wouldn't have to walk 60 yards in the snow. Julian's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked down at his phone, his thumb tapping the screen without purpose. He knew the arena had cost $800,000. He also knew he hadn't ridden in it once since it was completed, preferring the heated facility in Connecticut where his trainer's other clients kept their horses. This is going to look incredibly bad, Julian muttered, his voice losing its heat, replaced by a hollow, whining tone. The sponsor from Palm Beach was coming up specifically to see the mare walk the poles. He's flying in on Thursday. I've already booked the suite at the Red Lion. Then you should cancel the suite, Arthur said. The cancellation fee is only 50% if done before noon today. Julian didn't move. He stood by the desk, his phone screen dark now, his shadow long and thin across the limestone floor. He looked at the pile of payroll envelopes, his eyes lingering on the neat, black handwriting. You're not even trying, Julian said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the radiator. You're just sitting here, making envelopes. Arthur picked up his bone folder. He took a fresh envelope from the drawer, aligned the flap, and pressed the polished ox bone against the paper. "The staff expects their drafts by noon, Julian," Arthur said. "Unlike the Devon Show Committee, they do not work on credit." Julian stood there for another 10 seconds, his slippers scraping the rug as he shifted his weight. He looked as if he wanted to say something else, to demand, to threaten, to use their father's name, but the absolute, quiet, mechanical rhythm of Arthur's hands seemed to drain the words from him before they could reach his mouth. With a short, wet sniff, Julian turned and dragged his slippers back out into the hall, leaving the door wide open. Arthur did not go to close it. He waited until the sound of Julian's dragging footsteps had faded completely down the north corridor, replaced once more by the dry, rhythmic click, click of the grandfather clock in the hall. He drew the bone folder down the paper. Crease, press, slide. The vestibule of the main house was paved with gray Laurentian slate, cold enough in November to chill a man through the thick crepe soles of his shoes. A heavy brass umbrella stand, shaped like a section of an old cannon shell, sat in the corner, catching the steady, slow drip, drip of rainwater from a single black umbrella that had been left there since 9. Arthur stood by the hall tree, his fingers working the brass buttons of his wax canvas coat. Unbutton, loop, pull. The stiff, oiled cotton of the sleeve resisted his knuckles, smelling of paraffin, damp wool, and the faint, sweet trace of sheep's grease. He hung the coat on the low hook, the one that had been his since he was 12, positioned precisely 6 inches below the hook reserved for his father's heavy shearling. A car door closed outside in the gravel driveway, the solid, leaden thunk of a heavy German sedan. A moment later, the front door's brass bell gave a single, quiet chime as the door was pushed open against the draft excluder. Richard Sterling stepped into the warmth of the hall. He was a man of 72, his thin frame clad in a 3-piece charcoal tweed suit that looked as though it had been brushed by a valet every morning for 40 years. He carried a black leather Gladstone bag, its brass latches scratched and dull from decades of handling. He smelled of cold dampness, peppermint lozenges, and the dry, dead paper scent of old files. "Richard," Arthur said, taking a step forward. He did not offer his hand. Sterling's fingers were stiff with arthritis, and the old lawyer disliked the performance of a vigorous grip. "Arthur," Sterling replied, his voice a dry, cultivated whisper that had spent 50 years settling disputes in the wood-paneled chambers of Boston's probate courts. He set his bag on the oak bench by the door, his movements slow and economical. "Your father is in the sunroom?" "He's waiting for you. He had Mrs. Gable set out the dry sherry." Sterling paused, his thin hands hovering over the brass latches of his bag. He looked at Arthur through his wire-rimmed spectacles, his eyes small and sharp, like 2 gray beads behind the glass. "I sent over the revised trust draft last night, Arthur, the one concerning the timberland liquidation in Maine. I assumed you would have flagged the tax schedule by now." Arthur leaned back against the mahogany wainscoting, his hands slid quietly into his trousers' pockets. He looked down at the slate floor, where a small puddle of gray rainwater was slowly spreading from Sterling's boots. "I reviewed the draft, Richard," Arthur said. "And?" Sterling's left eyebrow rose a fraction of an inch. "You didn't send back your customary memorandum. Usually by 8 a.m., my secretary has 3 pages of single-spaced objections from you regarding the capital gains allocation." "The draft was structured exactly as my father requested," Arthur said. His voice was flat, carrying no more emotion than a printed receipt. It is, Sterling said, his voice dropping even lower as he leaned in slightly. But as the estate's administrator, surely you see what this does. If we liquidate the main timber holdings to fund Julian's new equestrian partnership as a direct capital distribution, the IRS will treat it as a non-exempt gift. The estate will incur an immediate 40% transfer tax, payable in the next fiscal quarter. We're talking about $360,000 in unnecessary exposure. Arthur did not blink. He made the calculation. Under the existing family office protocol, he could draft a 15-line structural amendment that redefined the timberland liquidation as a secured family mortgage to Julian's LLC, structured at the minimum federal interest rate. The transfer would be tax-free, the interest would be paid back into the primary trust, and the family's liquid reserves would remain untouched. It would take him 40 minutes of typing. If he stayed silent, the transfer would proceed as Charles had demanded in his drunk, arrogant mood over the weekend. The $360,000 tax bill would arrive in February. The primary operational account, already depleted by Julian's horse imports and show fees, would not have the funds to cover it. The trust would be forced to liquidate its municipal bond portfolio during a market downturn, permanently reducing the family's annual passive income by $45,000. The energy to draft the amendment, explain the tax code to his father, and protect Julian from his own greed was 85. The energy to let the document be signed as written and watch the tax liability settle silently onto their ledger was 0. My father was very specific in his instructions to your office, Richard, Arthur said, his eyes rising to meet the lawyer's. He said he did not want the administration of Julian's affairs to be cluttered by bookkeeping. I believe those were his exact words. Sterling stared at him. The old lawyer had represented the Vance family for 3 generations. He knew the precise structure of the estate's finances, and he knew that for 12 years, Arthur had been the thin, invisible wall standing between Charles's vanity and absolute insolvency. Arthur, Sterling said, his voice dropping into a register of genuine concern. This will severely limit the estate's liquidity heading into the spring. If we have to sell the Boston bonds to pay the tax, the discretionary income for the main house will be reduced. The main house has excessive overhead, Richard, Arthur said softly. Perhaps a reduction in discretionary funds will encourage a more conservative operational structure. Sterling let out a dry, rasping sigh. He reached down, clicked the brass latches of his Gladstone bag, and pulled out a thick sheaf of blue-backed legal documents. He held them by the edge, the heavy paper rustling in the quiet hall. "If you say so," Sterling murmured, "but your father won't understand the tax bill when it arrives. He will ask why you didn't prevent it." "I will show him the signed copy of his own instruction sheet," Arthur said. He reached out and touched the blue paper in Sterling's hand, his fingers dry and steady. "It is filed in the red cabinet in my office, under approved transfers." Sterling looked at the documents, then at Arthur's face. For the first time in 30 years, the old lawyer looked genuinely unsettled, as if he had just noticed a major crack in the foundation of a house he had deemed indestructible. "Very well," Sterling said. He tucked the papers under his arm and picked up his bag. "I'll go to the sunroom. Your brother is already in there. He was quite vocal when I arrived." "He missed the Devon entry deadline," Arthur said. "Ah," Sterling nodded slowly, a faint, cynical smile touching the corners of his mouth. "That explains the volume. He was trying to convince your father that the show committee's server had crashed." "The server was operational," Arthur said. He stepped aside, allowing the old lawyer to pass. As Sterling's heavy tweed coat brushed his shoulder, Arthur caught the faint scent of peppermint and cedar. He watched the lawyer walk down the long, carpeted corridor toward the sunroom, his steps quiet and hesitant on the thick wool runner. Arthur remained in the vestibule. He picked up his wax canvas coat from the hook, slid his arms back into the stiff, cold sleeves, and reached for the brass handle of the front door. He had 3 more payroll envelopes to deliver to the stables. The pigskin of the vintage English saddle was dry, thirsting for the neat's foot oil that Arthur applied with a small, circular sponge. Swirl, press, absorb. The oil darkened the pale, honey-colored leather of the seat, turning it a deep, bruised chestnut. Arthur worked the sponge under the knee rolls, where the leather was cracked from years of friction. This saddle had belonged to his mother. It was a custom Hermès from the late 70s, its brass nails stamped with the initials of a saddler in Paris who had been dead for 20 years. Nobody rode in it anymore. It was too narrow for the modern warm bloods Julian favored, but Arthur cleaned it every November to keep the leather from dry rotting into dust. The tack room was the quietest space on the estate. The walls were lined with polished cherry wood lockers, each displaying a brass nameplate of a horse that had once lived in the stables. The air was warm, heated by a quiet copper radiator that hissed like an old cat in the corner, smelling of harness honey, dry hay, and the sharp ammonia tang of horse sweat drifting from the wash stalls next door. The heavy latch of the tack room door clicked, and the door swung open. Julian entered, bringing with him the cold smell of the outdoor arena and a man Arthur had never seen before. The stranger was in his late 30s, wearing a brand-new, unblemished waxed jacket that still had the stiff, sharp creases of its shipping box. He wore leather paddock boots that were spotless, a detailed contrast to the muddy lane outside. "This is the main tack room," Julian said, gesturing around the wood-paneled space with a lazy sweep of his leather-gloved hand. He didn't look at Arthur, who was kneeling by the saddle rack near the radiator. "We keep the show harnesses here. Arthur, this is Trent. He drove up from New Jersey to look at the mare's hock." Trent stepped forward, his eyes scanning the cherry wood cabinets with an appreciative squint. He smelled of strong peppermint chewing gum and a very sharp citrusy cologne that did not belong in a barn. "Impressive setup," Trent said, his voice carrying a smooth commercial cadence. He nodded toward Arthur. "How's it going?" Arthur did not stand up. He kept his sponge moving in a slow, rhythmic circle across the saddle's skirt. "Good afternoon." Trent took a look at Vance's legacy, Julian said, leaning his hip against a heavy oak cleaning horse. He pulled off his leather gloves, one finger at a time, and dropped them onto the counter where Arthur's clean oil rags were stacked. "He agrees with me. She's not lame. She just has some localized swelling from the transport. A week of the German supplement and some light treadmill work, and she'll be perfectly fine for the winter circuit." Trent didn't contradict him. He stood with his hands tucked into the pockets of his stiff jacket, his gaze resting on the Hermès saddle Arthur was cleaning. "The mare's got class, Julian. Just needs the right program. My fee for the day consultation is $1,500 plus $300 for the travel." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small pre-printed carbon invoice, neatly folded in half. He held it out toward Arthur. "Julian said you'd take care of this today," Trent said. "I usually require a bank draft or a wire before I leave the property. Keeps the accounting clean." Arthur let his sponge rest in the tin of oil. He looked at the white slip of paper in Trent's hand. He made the calculation. The stable division's petty cash had been depleted by Julian's $5,000 Farrier withdrawal that morning. The primary operating account's commercial line was still frozen, and the remaining liquid funds were earmarked for Wednesday's municipal tax payment. To pay Trent's $1,800 invoice would require Arthur to log into his personal brokerage account, initiate a wire transfer to the farm's secondary ledger, and then write a check from that ledger to Trent. If he did that, Julian's New Jersey trainer would be paid, Julian's program would continue, and Julian would remain blissfully unaware of the financial gridlock he had created. If Arthur simply accepted the invoice and placed it in his pocket without initiating the transfer, the invoice would remain unpaid. By Friday, Trent's office in New Jersey would send a formal collections notice to the estate. By Monday, they would call Julian's personal cell phone. Within 10 days, the trainer would mention to his other elite clients in Palm Beach that the Vance family was slow paying their day fees, a rumor that, in the small, gossipy world of high-end equestrian sport, was more damaging than a tax audit. The energy to transfer his own money to save Julian's reputation was 92. The energy to pocket the slip of paper and let the silence do its work was 1. Arthur reached out his hand. His fingers, slightly darkened by the neatsfoot oil, took the folded carbon invoice. "Thank you, Trent," Arthur said, his voice level, matching the quiet hum of the radiator. "I'll file this." "Great," Trent said, turning back toward Julian, his shoulders relaxing. "I appreciate it. Julian, we should talk about the boarding contracts for Wellington. If you want those 3 prime stalls near the warm-up ring, we need to secure them with a 10% deposit by Friday." "Of course," Julian said, straightening up from the cleaning horse and grabbing his leather gloves from Arthur's clean rags. He didn't look at Arthur as he spoke. "My brother will handle the deposit. He has all the trust schedules. We'll have the wire sent over tomorrow morning." "Sounds like a plan," Trent said. They both walked toward the door, their boots clicking on the slate threshold. Julian had his phone out again, already typing a message, his shoulder brushing the doorframe as he left. "See you Thursday, Julian." Trent's voice drifted back from the hallway, followed by the heavy iron rattle of the outer barn door sliding closed. Arthur sat in the quiet of the tack room. He did not look at the invoice. He folded it once more, making a sharp, clean crease with his thumb, and slipped it into the breast pocket of his wax canvas coat, right behind the folded memo from his father. He picked up his sponge. He dipped it back into the tin of neatsfoot oil, letting the dark, greasy liquid saturate the foam until it was heavy and dripping. He returned to the Hermes saddle. Swirl, press, absorb. The leather of the seat was almost fully dark now, the pale honey color completely gone, replaced by a deep, lightless brown that showed none of the original grain. It looked heavy, cold, and entirely saturated, unable to take in a single drop more. The light at 4:45 p.m. was a thin, bruised violet that bled through the leaded panes of Arthur's office, casting long gray ribs of shadow across the limestone floor. He did not turn on the desk lamp. The dimness was gentler on his eyes after 8 hours of matching serial numbers on ancient land grants with the digital state registry. Arthur held a small white plastic puff bottle of dry graphite lubricant. He leaned down before the heavy, dark green iron safe that sat in the recess beneath the window. Puff, click, turn. He inserted the thin plastic nozzle into the keyhole of the safe's double lock mechanism, squeezed a tiny cloud of dark gray powder into the brass keyway, and inserted the heavy 6-inch iron key. The metal was cold, smelling of old iron and grease. He turned the key slowly to the left. The internal tumblers yielded with a heavy, satisfying clank shudder that vibrated through the floorboards into his knees. This safe held the physical land deeds, the original parchment sheets from the 19th century, wrapped in dry, oiled silk that secured the boundaries of the Vance estate's 400 contiguous acres. The door of his office creaked. It didn't open wide, but enough to admit the yellow light from the hallway and the dry, sweet smell of Dunhill pipe tobacco that always clung to Charles's wool waistcoats. Charles did not enter. He stood in the doorway, a low glass of amber scotch held loosely in his right hand, the ice cubes clinking softly against the heavy crystal as he shifted his weight. His face was in shadow, but the firelight from the corridor glinted off the silver buttons of his waistcoat. "Richard left," Charles said. His voice was thick, slightly slurred at the edges, the product of his third mid-afternoon glass. He did not look at Arthur. His eyes were fixed on the framed oil painting of a champion colt from 1954 that hung above the safe. He seemed very worked up about the Maine timberland sale. Kept talking about some tax exposure in the spring. Arthur did not stand up. He remained kneeling by the open safe, his hand resting on the cool iron door. "The Maine property is a non-agricultural capital asset, Father." "Richard was always an old woman about the IRS," Charles said, taking a slow sip of his drink. The ice rattled, a tiny, dry sound like pebbles rolling in a stream. "I told him we have the farm offsets. I told him you'd just write off the transfer against the depreciation on the new indoor arena. That's what you did with the tractor fleet 3 years ago." Arthur looked at the key in the lock. He made the calculation. The depreciation write-off for the $800,000 indoor arena had indeed been processed 3 years ago. Under federal tax law, that deduction was fully exhausted. It could not be carried forward to offset the capital gains of the Maine timberland sale. Furthermore, because Julian's new equestrian venture was registered as an independent LLC rather than an agricultural cooperative, it was legally ineligible for any farm-related tax offsets whatsoever. To explain this to Charles would require 30 minutes of showing him the federal tax code schedules, which Charles would inevitably ignore. It would involve pointing out that Charles had already signed the unconditional timberland liquidation papers in front of Sterling, meaning the 40% transfer tax was now legally locked into their ledger. If Arthur stayed silent, the tax liability would remain unoffset. In April, the IRS would issue a direct assessment for $360,000. The family trust would have to pay it. "The Maine transfer has been filed exactly as you authorized in the sunroom, Father," Arthur said. His voice was low, flat, and completely devoid of inflection. "Richard has the signed documents." "Good," Charles said, his head nodding once, a slow, heavy movement of satisfaction. He took another sip of his scotch, the ice clinking against his teeth. "I knew you'd have it sorted. Your brother's got enough on his plate with this New Jersey trainer. We don't need Richard cluttering things up with his Boston worries." Arthur did not correct him. He did not point out that "filed as authorized" meant the tax hit would land with its full, unmitigated weight. "The documentation is complete," Arthur said. Charles lingered in the doorway for another 10 seconds, the sweet, heavy smell of his tobacco drifting into the cold room. He looked at the painting of the colt again, his thumb rubbing the side of his glass. "Your mother always said the mainland was useless anyway," Charles muttered, almost to himself. "Nothing but pine trees and rocks. Julian's mare. She's got real blood. If she wins the regional stakes in January, we can double her breeding fee. That's where the real capital is, not in dirt." Arthur did not answer. He reached into the safe and pulled out a heavy blue cardboard folder containing the original 1911 plat maps of the estate. The paper was dry, the edges yellowed and crumbling slightly under his fingertips. "Don't stay up too late with those ledgers, Arthur," Charles said, his voice fading as he turned back toward the corridor. "We have the zoning board dinner tomorrow night. I need you to have the municipal water report ready before we leave." "It's on your desk, Father," Arthur said. The heavy footsteps of his father faded down the hall, followed by the distant, muffled sound of the billiard room door closing. Arthur sat on the cold floor by the safe. He did not look at the plat maps. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He opened his personal banking application, navigating to his private investment portfolio. Over the last 6 months, he had been quietly moving his personal funds out of the family's joint trust accounts and into a secure, liquid private equity fund in Delaware. The transfer process had been slow, conducted in small increments that remained below the reporting threshold of the Boston office's compliance algorithms. He checked the ledger. The final transfer of his liquid shares had cleared at 4:15 p.m. today. He now had $942,000 in cash, plus $5 million in private, non-family equity holdings that were completely shielded from any liabilities the Vance family holding company might incur in the coming spring. He closed the safe door. The heavy iron latch clicked home with a clean, dry sound that seemed to settle the air in the room. He turned the iron key back to the right, locked the safe, and pulled the key from the keyway. A tiny smudge of gray graphite powder remained on his thumb. He did not wipe it off. He pressed his thumb against the margin of the blue cardboard folder, leaving a dark, dusty print right next to his mother's signature from 1982. The air in Arthur's private study had dropped to 46 degrees by 11:15 p.m. He sat at his secondary desk, a small, plain pine table he had moved into the corner of the room 3 winters ago, leaving the grand mahogany desk to gather dust under the dead light of the chandelier. He was wearing his heavy, ribbed Irish wool sweater, the high collar turned up against his jaw. Sort, stack, slide. With his right hand, Arthur organized a small stack of personal papers, his birth certificate, his passport, the original deed to a small 2-acre parcel of orchard land in Vermont that had been left to him directly by his maternal grandmother, completely outside the Vance family trusts. Beside these sat his personal bank statements, their margins clean, free of the red-inked penciling that cluttered the family's estate binders. He used a small brass paperclip, sliding it over the corner of the papers with a tight, metallic click. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose copper flashing on the chimney pot. A sudden, sharp rumble echoed from the gravel driveway, the heavy, uneven roar of Julian's sports car. The engine revved twice, a loud, aggressive sound that cut through the frozen night before being abruptly cut off. A moment later, a car door slammed. Thump. It was followed by the sound of boots dragging heavily across the frozen gravel, then the metallic rattle of the iron latch on the side door. Julian was cursing under his breath. Arthur heard his voice, muffled by the thick stone walls, rising up from the lower vestibule. "It's like a tomb in here." Julian's voice drifted up the stairwell. He was on his phone, his tone sharp with that thin, vibrating petulance that had become his constant register over the last 3 days. "No, I'm telling you, the gate was stuck again. I had to get out of the car in the freezing rain to manual override the arm. And the house is freezing. I can see my breath in the kitchen." There was a pause. Arthur could hear the low, metallic hum of the kitchen's sub-zero refrigerator cycling on, a dry rattle that only happened when the ambient temperature in the kitchen fell below 50 degrees. "I don't know what Arthur does all day," Julian continued, his voice growing louder as he walked toward the stairs. "He's probably sitting in his office with his little ledgers, ignoring everything. The heating oil truck was supposed to come on Tuesday. I'm going to have to sleep in my shearling coat. Arthur did not move. He kept his eyes on the small stack of Vermont orchard papers. He made the calculation. The heating oil company, Northside Fuel, had indeed skipped their scheduled Tuesday delivery. The automated system had flagged the Vance estate's account because the primary credit card on file, the one linked to the frozen commercial line, had been declined for the monthly recurring charge. Arthur had received the automated email notification at 8 a.m. on Monday. He could have resolved it in 30 seconds. He could have logged into the Northside portal, updated the billing profile with the family's secondary checking account, and requested an emergency delivery. The truck would have arrived by Tuesday afternoon, and the massive hydronic boiler in the basement would be humming, keeping the 64 rooms of the main house at a steady, comfortable 68 degrees. Doing so would have required 60 units of administrative energy, writing the reconciliation memo, explaining the account swap to the Boston trustees, and once again protecting his father and brother from the consequences of their frozen line. Letting the house grow cold required zero. Arthur reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small amber glass bottle of eucalyptus oil. He unscrewed the black plastic cap, letting the sharp, medicinal scent rise into the cold room, masking the smell of damp plaster and old coal dust that always seeped from the floorboards when the heat went out. He tipped a single drop onto his finger and rubbed it into the dry skin of his knuckles. Down the hall, the heavy oak door of Julian's bedroom slammed shut, the vibration rattling the small brass picture frames on Arthur's wall. The silence returned, heavier now, filled only by the dry, rhythmic clicking of the grandfather clock in the corridor and the low, hollow whistle of the wind through the chimney. The family's world was shrinking. They did not understand that the gates, the heat, the credit lines, and the fuel deliveries were not natural phenomena like the rain or the seasons. They did not understand that the estate only functioned because Arthur spent 12 hours a day quietly greasing the gears, anticipating the friction before it could stop the machine. Now, he was simply letting the grease dry out. Arthur placed the small stack of personal documents into his leather briefcase. He closed the brass latches, the locks snapping shut with two distinct, clean clicks that sounded like the end of a conversation. He turned off the desk lamp. The room vanished into the blackness of the winter night, leaving only the pale, cold outline of the window frame against the gray sky. Arthur stood in the dark, his hands tucked deep into the sleeves of his heavy wool sweater, feeling the cold air settle against his face. He did not feel angry. He did not feel vengeful. He felt only the deep, quiet satisfaction of a man who had successfully moved his weight off a collapsing bridge before the timber began to crack. The orange glow of the electric space heater's wire coils was the only warm thing in the room. It sat by Arthur's feet, hummed with a low, dry vibration that smelled of hot copper and toasted dust. When the draft from the sash window hit the heater, the metal safety grate gave a tiny, sharp ping as the iron contracted. Arthur sat in his coat, his hands gloved in thin, black wool liners that had the fingertips cut out. Write, lift, slide. With his fountain pen, he wrote a single name at the top of a yellow legal pad, the Henderson Trust. The gold nib of the pen scraped against the rough, cheap paper with a dry, rhythmic sound like a cricket in dry grass. Below the Henderson name, he wrote 3 numbers: the current total asset value, the yield percentage under his direct management, and the private cell phone number of Thomas Henderson, the patriarch who had refused to speak to Charles for 7 years after Charles showed up drunk to a zoning committee meeting. Arthur had managed the Henderson portfolio since 2018. He had grown their capital by 14% annually, mostly by avoiding the flashy, high-risk real estate joint ventures Charles favored, and focusing instead on quiet, unglamorous, triple-net leases in New Hampshire. From the master suite at the end of the North Corridor, the muffled sound of a telephone ringing broke the silence. It rang 5 times, stopped, then started again. A moment later, the heavy door of the master suite was thrown open, and Charles's voice boomed down the hall, distorted by the cold air and the bare, uncarpeted floors. "Arthur! Arthur, get in here! Where the hell is the administrative token?" Arthur's hand remained steady. He drew a neat, horizontal line beneath Thomas Henderson's phone number, then began to write the next name, the Albright Foundation. "Arthur!" The footsteps were heavier today, dragging slightly because of Charles's knee, but carrying the frantic weight of an old man whose daily routine had been interrupted. The footsteps stopped outside Arthur's closed door. The brass latch rattled, and Charles pushed the door open, a thick draft of unheated air rushing into the room behind him. Charles was wearing his heavy shearling coat over his pajamas, his silver hair standing up in wild, uncombed tufts. His face was red, his veins prominent around his temples. He was holding his desk phone's cordless handset in his right hand, like a weapon. "The Boston office has blocked the wire to Baltimore," Charles barked, his breath rising in a thin white cloud that dissipated near the ceiling. "Julian's horse van is sitting at the dock. The import broker says if the duty isn't paid by noon, they're going to move the vehicle to a state storage facility. It's $600 a day in storage fees, Arthur." Arthur did not look up from his pad. He finished writing the zip code for the Albright Foundation's registered office in Boston. "The wire was blocked because the capital allocation exceeded the quarterly discretionary limit," Arthur said, his voice flat, matching the steady hum of the space heater. "I know why it was blocked," Charles shouted, taking 2 steps into the office, his slippers scuffing the floorboards. "I'm the managing partner. I authorized it. The bank is telling me my administrative login has been flagged for multi-factor mismatch. They want the physical key fob. Where is it?" Arthur looked at his yellow pad. He made the calculation. The physical key fob, the little gray plastic device that generated a fresh 6-digit authorization code every 30 seconds, was currently sitting in the top drawer of his own desk, hidden beneath a stack of old horse registration forms. With his administrator access, Arthur could log into the Boston portal, bypass the multi-factor lock for Charles's account, and release the Baltimore wire within 45 seconds. The horse van would be released, the storage fees avoided, and Julian's brand-new leather-lined transport vehicle would be on a trailer to the estate by nightfall. Doing so would require 80 units of cognitive energy. Validating the transfer, writing the corresponding ledger entry to explain the trust distribution to the Boston trustees, and once again acting as the invisible shield that kept the family's operational gears from grinding to a halt. Letting the wire remain blocked, letting the van sit in Baltimore, and letting the automated $600 a day penalty pile up on Julian's personal ledger required 0. "The fobs were updated by the Boston Compliance Department in January, Father," Arthur said, his pen resuming its slow, dry scrape across the yellow paper. "Your registration profile was never completed because you didn't return the signature card." "What signature card?" Charles demanded, throwing his hands up, the phone handset swinging wildly. "I don't have time for signature cards. That's your job. You're the administrator." "The compliance guidelines require the managing partner's personal signature on the physical form, Father," Arthur said. "I placed the form on your sideboard with the morning mail 3 weeks ago. It was next to your equestrian club billing." Charles stared at him, his mouth slightly open, his chest rising and falling beneath his shearling coat. He looked down at the handset in his hand, which was currently emitting a low, rhythmic beep, the sound of the Boston operator having hung up after 3 minutes on hold. "Well, find it," Charles muttered, his voice losing its explosive edge, replaced by the heavy, stubborn vibration of an old man who refused to admit he had made a mistake. "Find the form and sign it for me. You have my power of attorney for the office accounts anyway." "My power of attorney for the operational accounts was suspended under the new trust agreement," Arthur said softly. Charles blinked, his brow furrowing. "Suspended? When?" "In June," Arthur said, finally lifting his head to look at his father. His eyes were calm, dark, and completely empty of any desire to assist. "When you restructured the holding company to designate Julian as the sole beneficiary of the agricultural assets, the Boston trustees required the administrative powers to be aligned with the primary equity holder. Julian is the primary holder. Therefore, only his signature or yours can override the compliance blocks." Charles stood in the cold room, the orange light of the space heater reflecting off his slippers. He looked around the office, his eyes lingering on the empty bookshelves, the cardboard boxes stacked against the wall, and the small pine desk in the corner. He didn't say anything for 5 seconds. The only sound was the dry, rhythmic ping of the heater's metal grate as the cold draft hit it again. "Julian doesn't know how to log into the Boston portal," Charles said, his voice dropping into a quiet, flat drone. "I am aware of that," Arthur said. "Then how do we get the van out?" "Julian will have to call the bank manager personally," Arthur said, his pen returning to the yellow pad. "He will need to verify his identity, request a temporary password reset, and have the physical signature card overnighted to his cottage. Once he signs it and returns it via courier, the bank will release the line. It should take about 4 business days." "4 days?" Charles's voice cracked slightly. "The storage fees will be $2,400, and the van is sitting in the open air near the salt water." "The storage facility is covered, Father," Arthur said, his pen writing the 3rd name on his list, the Delancey estate. "Though they do charge an additional $80 a day for security." Charles stood still for a moment longer, his breathing heavy in the cold air. He looked at Arthur, then at the yellow pad, then at the closed briefcase sitting by Arthur's feet. For a second, a flicker of something like understanding or fear seemed to touch his old face before being washed away by his usual red, Scotch-fueled mask of irritation. "This is ridiculous," Charles muttered, turning back toward the door. "An absolute circus. I'm going to call Harrison. He'll make those Boston idiots clear the line." He dragged his slippers back out into the corridor, leaving the door wide open. Arthur did not go to close it. He let the cold draft from the hallway sweep through the room, swirling the steam from his peppermint tea until it vanished into the dark corners of the ceiling. He wrote the 4th name, the Curtis Group. The silent preparation was almost complete. The clay pot was cold, its orange terracotta surface coated in a dry, white crust of mineral salts that scraped off under Arthur's thumbnail like dry skin. He sat on a rusted iron stool in the conservatory, a small glass-walled structure built onto the south side of the carriage house. It was a space his mother had used for her orchids, but now it held only dead vines, empty seed trays, and a single, struggling maidenhair fern that had somehow survived the winter on the condensation dripping from a cracked pane above. Arthur used a thin wooden chopstick to tease the compacted dry peat away from the fern's roots. Tease. Shake. Clear. He worked with microscopic patience, loosening the dark, dense ball of dirt without snapping the delicate, black, hair-like roots that clung to the dry soil. He wanted the roots completely bare, free of the old, exhausted earth that had long since been depleted of its nutrients before he transitioned the plant into the fresh loam he had brought from the greenhouse. Through a gap in the glass where the putty had dried and fallen away, the sound of boots marching down the gravel path outside grew louder. It was Julian. He was on speakerphone, his arm outstretched as he paced the narrow strip of brick that led to the tractor shed. The tinny, metallic voice of Trent, the New Jersey trainer, drifted through the broken glass, sharp and impatient against the quiet rustle of the wind in the dry ivy. "Julian, I'm being very reasonable here," Trent's voice said, the signal buzzing slightly as a cloud passed over the valley. "But I've got the Miller family from Philadelphia calling me every 2 hours. They want those 3 stalls by the warm-up ring. They have their bank draft ready to send. If your family office doesn't wire the deposit by 5 today, I have to let them go." "It's just a compliance delay, Trent," Julian said, his voice rising, carrying that forced, airy confidence he used when he was trying to sell a horse he knew was unsound. "My brother is processing the capital release as we speak. The funds are already earmarked in our secondary agricultural ledger. It's just a matter of the Boston office clearing the automated token." "I've heard about these compliance delays before, Julian," Trent replied, his tone growing cooler, more transactional. "Usually it means the account is short. In this business, if the money isn't in the hand, the horse stays in the trailer. 5 o'clock. If the wire isn't confirmed by then, I'm signing the Miller's contract." "It'll be there, Trent. I guarantee it. My brother is on it." Julian ended the call with a sharp flick of his thumb. He stood on the brick path for a moment, his shoulders hunched under his canvas coat, his eyes fixed on the screen of his phone as if waiting for a miracle to blink into existence. He didn't look toward the conservatory. He didn't think Arthur was anywhere but his office, sitting before his ledgers like a piece of furniture. Arthur did not call out. He did not tap on the glass. He turned the fern in his hand, gently brushing a small clump of gray, moldy peat from the very center of the root ball. He made the calculation. He could easily open his laptop, access his personal liquid capital account, and wire the $45,000 boarding deposit to Trent's LLC. He could structure it as a short-term, zero-interest personal loan to Julian, securing the Wellington stalls and saving his brother's winter season before the 5 o'clock deadline. The energy to do this, draft the loan agreement, and then try to collect the $45,000 from Julian's depleted personal allowance over the next 6 months was 95. The energy to let the deadline pass, let the Millers take the stalls, and watch Julian's winter campaign collapse before it even started was 0. He chose 0. Arthur's phone vibrated in his pocket, a soft double buzz that was different from the sharp ring of his father's calls. He pulled it out, his fingers slightly dirty from the fern roots, leaving a faint brown smudge on the glass screen. The caller ID showed a number with a Boston area code. It was Clara Vance Loring, his cousin, and a senior partner at Loring Private Wealth, a boutique investment firm that operated completely independent of the main Vance family holdings. Arthur slid the button to accept. He held the phone to his ear with his shoulder, his hands remaining focused on the fern. "Clara," Arthur said. "Arthur," her voice came through, clean, sharp, and smelling metaphorically of polished mahogany and high-rise glass. "I've received the signed authorization forms from the Henderson Trust and the Albright Foundation. Thomas Henderson called me personally this morning. He said he's ready to move his entire liquid portfolio, $42 million, to our firm the moment you file your formal resignation. And the Delancey estate? Arthur asked, his chopstick gently loosening the last tight knot of roots near the base of the plant. Their trustee is signing the transfer orders as we speak, Clara said. They're bringing over $28 million in commercial real estate paper. Arthur, this is almost $80 million in assets under management. If you bring the Curtis Group over by Friday, you'll have effectively emptied the Vance family office's external client base. The Curtis Group will sign tomorrow, Arthur said. His voice was quiet, steady, matching the drip-drip of the copper pipe in the concrete basin. I am meeting their representative at the Red Lion at 10. And your father? Clara paused, the quiet rustle of paper audible over the line. Does he have any idea what you're doing? No, Arthur said. He's going to sue you, Arthur, Clara said, her voice dropping into a professional, cautious register. He'll claim tortious interference. He'll say you poached the clients while under contract as the estate's administrator. My contract as the estate's administrator was dissolved in June, Arthur said. He turned the fern over, the roots now completely bare, looking like a delicate black skeleton in his palm. When they restructured the holding company to designate Julian as the sole beneficiary, they removed my salary and reclassified my position as a family contributor to avoid paying payroll taxes on my draw. Under Massachusetts labor law, a non-salaried family contributor has no fiduciary duty of non-competition. Clara was silent for 3 seconds. Then, a low, quiet laugh escaped her. You let them do that, she said. They wanted to save $8,400 a year in payroll taxes, Arthur said. My father was very pleased with the savings. He bought a new set of silver-mounted bits with the difference. My God, Arthur, Clara murmured. They really didn't look at the details, did they? They never look at the details, Clara, Arthur said. They only look at the silver. The transfer documents are locked in our secure server, she said. The moment you send your resignation email, we pull the trigger on the asset transfers. It will take the Boston custodian about 48 hours to process the liquidations. Understood, Arthur said. I will call you tomorrow after the Curtis meeting. He ended the call, slid the phone back into his pocket, and picked up the fresh, black loam from the bucket by his feet. He placed the bare, black roots of the fern into the center of the clean clay pot, gently packing the dark, moist earth around them until the plant stood straight and firm, supported by soil that was entirely new. Outside, the shadow of the carriage house had stretched across the brick path, burying the spot where Julian had been standing in a cold, deep blue. The tin of black wax polish was small, cold, and smelled sharply of turpentine and industrial solvents. Arthur dipped the corner of a clean cotton rag into the dark grease, collecting a small, dark bead of wax on his index finger. He rubbed the wax into the toe cap of his left Oxford shoe. Rub, buff, circle. The calfskin was high-grade, French-tanned leather that had been hand-lasted in Northamptonshire. Under the circular friction of his finger, the dull, grayish tint of the dried leather slowly vanished, replaced by a deep, mirror's edge black that reflected the low, yellow light of his bedside lamp. Arthur worked with a steady, unhurried rhythm, ensuring the wax was pressed deep into the seams where the leather met the welt. Downstairs, a door slammed. It was followed by the low, rumbling vibration of Charles's voice rising from the library below. The sound traveled up through the old plaster of the chimney breast, distorted and hollowed out by the empty rooms, but carrying that unmistakable, jagged edge of old money anger. Then, the house intercom on Arthur's wall gave a sharp, staticky buzz. Bzz. Arthur, Charles's voice came through the small plastic speaker, thin and metallic. In the library, bring the agricultural ledger. Arthur did not stop his hand. He finished the circular buffing of the toe cap, laid the shoe down beside its pair, and carefully pressed the metal lid back onto the polished tin. He wiped his fingers with a clean, dry cloth, checking his knuckles for any trace of black grease. Finding none, he reached for his tweed jacket hanging on the back of the chair. He did not bring the ledger. When he entered the library, the fire he had built earlier was burning low, the birch logs reduced to white, glowing skeletons that gave off more ash than heat. Charles was sitting behind his mahogany desk, his reading glasses pushed up into his silver hair. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him, but it was empty. Julian stood by the tall window, his back to the room, his forehead pressed against the cold glass. His hands were stuffed deep into the pockets of his trousers, his shoulders hunched so tight that his neck seemed to have vanished into his collar. "Where is the ledger?" Charles asked, his voice gravelly, his eyes scanning Arthur's empty hands. "The ledger is currently being audited for the quarterly tax reconciliation, Father," Arthur said. He stood near the door, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his posture as neutral and still as an empty coat rack. "The trainer from New Jersey called me," Charles said, his voice dropping into a quiet, heavy rumble. He picked up his pen, tapping the gold cap against the empty yellow pad. "He says we lost the Wellington stalls. He says he had to release them to some family from Philadelphia because the wire didn't clear by 5. "That is correct," Arthur said. Julian didn't turn around, but his shoulders stiffened. "It was a system glitch," he muttered toward the window pane, his breath fogging the glass. "The Boston custodian frozen the agricultural line over a hospitality allocation. It's a completely standard transaction that Arthur has run 20 times before. He chose not to clear it." Charles looked at Arthur, his thick white eyebrows drawing together in a hard, squinting line. "Is that true, Arthur? Did you let the deadline pass without clearing the line?" Arthur made the calculation. He could point out that he had explicitly warned Julian at noon yesterday about the two-factor token. He could remind Charles that the power of attorney had been stripped from his position in June to save $8,400 in payroll taxes. He could pull his phone from his pocket, show them the automated emails from the Boston office, and prove that Julian had been notified of the credit freeze 3 days ago. Doing so would require 60 units of explanation, arguing with Julian's defensive lies, managing Charles's denial, and trying to salvage a horseboarding deal that was already dead. Remaining silent, letting Julian's weaponized incompetence hang in the cold air of the library, required 0. "My authority to override the Boston compliance blocks was terminated in June, Father," Arthur said. His voice was smooth, quiet, and entirely empty of defensive heat. "As the designated sole beneficiary of the agricultural assets, Julian is the only individual authorized to sign the manual override cards. The bank requires his signature." Charles turned his head slowly to look at Julian. "Is that true?" Julian finally turned away from the window. His face was pale, his eyes wide and blinking against the light of the green desk lamp. I didn't receive any signature cards, Father. If the bank sent them, they must have gone to the family office. Arthur handles the mail." "The card was placed on your sideboard in the guest cottage on November 3rd, Arthur said, his tone dry and factual, as if he were reading a line from a shipping manifest. "Along with your quarterly membership dues for the equestrian club. It was signed for by your housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, at 10:15 a.m. Julian's mouth opened slightly. He looked down at his shoes, his thumb rubbing the seam of his pocket. He remembered the stack of mail Mrs. Gable had left on the kitchen counter, a stack he had swept into the wicker wastebasket 3 days later without opening because it was mostly municipal circulars and bank rubbish. I must have misplaced it, Julian whispered. But Arthur could have called the bank manager. He knows Harrison. He could have had them run an emergency waiver. Harrison was in New York for the trustees' meeting, Arthur said, and the waiver requires a signed corporate resolution. Since I am no longer a salaried officer of the holding company, I cannot sign resolutions. Charles looked down at the empty yellow pad. He tapped his pen once, twice, the gold cap making a sharp, hollow click against the mahogany. He was 74, and for 50 years his world had been organized by people who quietly fixed his mistakes before he had to acknowledge them. His father had done it, his wife had done it, and for 12 years Arthur had done it. Now he was looking at a $360,000 transfer tax bill coming in the spring, a frozen commercial credit line, and a son who couldn't keep a horseboarding slot because he had thrown a signature card into the trash. "This is," Charles started, then stopped. He didn't have the vocabulary for administrative failure. He looked at Julian, his eyes cold and narrow. "You told me the New Jersey trainer was solid, Julian. You told me the Wellington program was locked in." "It is solid, Father," Julian said, his voice cracking slightly as he stepped toward the desk. "We can still get stalls. We'll just have to lease them from the Pendleton Group. It'll cost a bit more, maybe $60,000 for the season instead of $45,000, but we can still do it." "With what money?" Charles asked, his voice dropping into a dangerously quiet register. "The main timberland proceeds are frozen until the transfer tax is cleared in March. The operating account is down to $46,000, and the municipal property tax is auto-drafting tomorrow." Julian blinked. "What property tax?" Charles didn't answer. He turned his head and looked at Arthur, who was still standing by the door, his hands behind his back, his tweed jacket perfectly brushed. "Arthur," Charles said, his voice carrying a sudden, desperate note of appeal that he had never used before. "The municipal tax draft tomorrow, is that covered?" "The auto draft will clear tomorrow at 9 a.m., Father," Arthur said, his voice level and calm. "The funds are in the secondary reserve." Charles let out a long, heavy breath, his shoulders dropping an inch. "Good. Thank you. And the Boston line?" "The Boston Compliance Department will process the account verification once Julian returns the signed signature card," Arthur said. "I have overnighted a duplicate form to his cottage. It should arrive by noon tomorrow." He did not mention that the auto draft of the property tax would deplete the secondary reserve to exactly $3,212, leaving the estate with virtually no liquid capital to cover Julian's New Jersey trainer invoice, the heating oil delivery, or the weekly stable payroll due on Friday. He did not mention that his own formal resignation from the family office was already drafted and scheduled to send at 9:15 a.m. tomorrow, exactly 15 minutes after the tax draft cleared. "Thank you, Arthur," Charles said, his hand waving a brief, dismissive circle in the air. "That's all. Go finish the tax audit." "Good night, Father," Arthur said. He turned and walked out of the library, closing the heavy oak door behind him with a quiet, solid click that felt like the final turn of a key. The tavern room of the Red Lion Inn was nearly empty at 8:45 a.m. A single wide hearth fireplace in the corner was fed with seasoned maple, the sweet, heavy smoke drifting through the low-ceilinged room to mingle with the smell of wet wool and fried bacon from the kitchen. Arthur sat in the corner booth where the dark oak bench had been worn smooth by 2 centuries of travelers. He had a small bottle of glass cleaner and a gray microfiber cloth laid out on the table. Spray, wipe, polish. He cleaned his spectacles, holding them up to the pale, watery morning light that struggled through the small leaded window panes. The glass was slightly pitted from winter salt, casting tiny, distorted starbursts of white glare across the dark wood of the table. He slid the glasses back onto his nose, the metal frames cold against the bridge of his skin. He placed the cleaning cloth back into his leather bag next to a fresh manila folder. On the front of the folder, a small typed label read, "The Curtis Group, Asset Allocation." The door of the tavern gave a dull, heavy creak as it was pushed open, followed by the soft, dry ring of the brass bell mounted on the frame. Elizabeth Hayes stepped into the warmth. She was 45, her dark hair pulled back into a tight, severe knot, her long wool coat of charcoal cashmere perfectly tailored. She carried a slim, gold-clasped leather portfolio under her arm. She did not look like a woman who spent her mornings in the Berkshires. She looked like Boston's financial district personified, dry, precise, and entirely unsentimental. She slid into the booth opposite Arthur, her movements quiet and economical. She did not offer a hand. They had known each other for 9 years, and their relationship had always been conducted with the clean, bloodless efficiency of a well-written contract. "The roads by the creek are iced over," Elizabeth said, her voice a low, clear contralto. "Your father's driveway must be a hazard." "The gate was manual override this morning," Arthur said. He did not explain further. He poured a stream of hot water from the ceramic teapot into his cup, the scent of bergamot rising between them in a thin, straight plume of steam. Elizabeth unclasped her portfolio, pulling out a 3-page document printed on heavy, high-grade bond paper. She laid it on the table between them, her fingers remaining on the edge. "The Curtis trustees signed the transfer orders at 4 yesterday," she said, her voice dropping a register as she looked at Arthur through her reading glasses. "That's $34 million in municipal bonds, $12 million in private placement debt, and the commercial warehouse holdings in Springfield. All of it. The Boston custodian has already cleared the transition queue." She looked at him, her gray eyes sharp behind her lenses. "This is the final piece, Arthur. With the Curtis assets moving to Loring Private Wealth, your family office has exactly 0 external clients remaining. The Vance Family Holding Company is now officially nothing more than a shell managing your father's personal debt and Julian's horses. The transition is orderly," Arthur said, his voice level. "Orderly for us," Elizabeth said, a faint, dry smile touching the corner of her mouth. "For your father, it's going to feel like the floor has been removed while he's standing on it. Have you filed your resignation?" Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He laid it face up on the table, next to his teacup. The digital clock on the screen read 8:58 a.m. "In 2 minutes," Arthur said. "And the town property tax?" Elizabeth asked, her eyes drifting to the phone. "The $68,000 for the main estate?" "The auto draft is scheduled for 9 a.m., Arthur said. "The secondary reserve has exactly $71,212 in it. It will clear." "Leaving them with $3,000 in liquid capital," Elizabeth murmured. She leaned back against the dark oak of the booth, her portfolio resting against her ribs. "And the weekly payroll is due on Friday. Miguel and the grooms, the housekeepers." "They have Julian's signature cards," Arthur said, his tone flat. "They can use the commercial credit line once the compliance documents are overnighted and processed." "Which takes 4 days," Elizabeth said. She knew the banking systems as well as he did. "During which time the horses have no imported feed, the staff has no pay, and the heating oil company won't deliver because the card is declined. Arthur, the house will be at 40 degrees by Friday night." Arthur did not answer. He watched the digital clock on his phone screen, 8:59 a.m. He picked up his teacup, taking a slow, quiet sip. The tea was hot, bitter with the taste of bergamot, warming his throat against the chill that had seeped into the tavern from the street. The clock ticked. 9 a.m. A small blue notification bubble blinked at the top of his phone screen, a quiet, automated receipt from the Berkshire County Savings Bank. Transaction confirmed. Municipal property tax draft, $68,000. Arthur did not smile. He set the cup down, his fingers dry and steady. He tapped the notification away, navigated to his scheduled email drafts, and opened the message addressed to Charles Vance, Julian Vance, Richard Sterling, and the Boston Board of Trustees. The message was 3 lines long. Effective 9:15 a.m. today, I resign my position as administrator of the Vance Family Office and its affiliates. All active estate ledgers, municipal filings, and tax schedules are filed in the red cabinet in the study. No further transitional services will be provided. A.V. Are you sure you want to make this cut so clean, Arthur? Elizabeth asked, her voice carrying a rare note of genuine curiosity. Your father is 74. He doesn't know how to access the digital treasury. Julian doesn't even know how to write a check that doesn't have a horse on the memo line. My father has Julian, Arthur said, his thumb hovering over the blue send button. He has repeatedly stated that Julian has the social presence required to sustain this family. I am merely allowing him the space to exercise that presence. It's a very cold space, Arthur, she said. It's a very expensive space, Arthur replied. His thumb came down. The screen blinked. Message sent. He slid the phone back into his pocket, picked up the manila folder containing the Curtis Group's asset allocation documents, and slid it into his leather bag. He closed the brass zipper, the metal teeth locking together with a single, long, metallic shk that sounded like the end of a chapter. He looked out the window. The fog was finally beginning to burn off, revealing the cold, white branches of the birch trees along the road, completely covered in ice that would not melt before sunset. We should begin the transition filings for the Curtis assets, Elizabeth, Arthur said, his voice smooth and empty. Loring Private Wealth expects the paperwork on their desks by noon. Of course, Elizabeth said, her professional mask sliding back into place as she opened her leather portfolio. Let's begin. The small office room above the bookstore in Great Barrington smelled of beeswax, fresh plaster, and the dry, sweet scent of old paper from the shelves below. Unlike the dim, walnut-paneled library of the Vance estate, this room had 3 wide sash windows that faced east, letting in a flood of cold, white winter sunlight that left no corner in shadow. Arthur stood by the simple, unfinished oak desk he had purchased from a local woodworker 2 days ago. He held a new, navy blue leather blotter, its edges finished with a quiet, hand-stitched gold thread. Align, press, smooth. He laid the blotter down, using the palm of his hand to smooth out any air trapped beneath the leather, ensuring the corners were perfectly square with the desk's edge. He then placed a heavy, solid bronze paperweight, shaped like a simple, polished river stone, in the upper right-hand corner. It was 2:30 p.m. His phone, which he had set to silent and placed face down on the corner of the oak wood, began to hum. Hum. Slide. Pause. Hum. It didn't ring, it just vibrated, a low, rhythmic drone that caused the phone to slide 2 inches across the polished oak before stopping against the bronze paperweight. The screen lit up with his father's name, Charles Vance, mobile. The call went to voicemail. 3 seconds later, the screen lit up again, Julian Vance, mobile. That call went to voicemail as well. Arthur did not look at the screen. He reached into his leather bag and pulled out 3 fresh black binders, each one containing the newly minted advisory agreements for the Henderson Trust, the Albright Foundation, and the Curtis Group. He laid them in a neat, overlapping diagonal on the left side of the blotter. The phone hummed again. This time, the caller ID showed the number for Richard Sterling's private office in Boston. Arthur picked up the phone, slid his thumb across the screen to check the automated transcriptions of the voicemails that had already accumulated over the last 45 minutes. The first transcript, from Charles at 1:45 p.m., was a disjointed string of words, the software struggling to make sense of the elderly man's shouting. "Access denied. Boston says, what is this? Loring wealth. Arthur, get on. The system is down." The second transcript, from Julian at 2:05 p.m., was shorter, his panic more focused. "Arthur, the bank says 80 million is gone. They're telling me Loring has the signature authorizations. Eleanor's husband called me. He says we're being audited. Where are you?" The third transcript, from Richard Sterling, was the only one that carried the cold weight of professional realization. "Arthur, Richard here. The Boston custodian has just executed the transition protocols for Henderson, Albright, and Curtis. Your resignation email arrived at 9:15. Your father he is convinced there has been a security breach. He is threatening to call the state police. I need you to call me back immediately so we can untangle this before it gets to the papers." Arthur closed the transcript screen. He made the calculation. He could call Sterling back. He could spend 40 minutes explaining the mechanics of the transition, showing him the signed authorizations from the 5 trustees, and reminding him of the June restructuring that had stripped Arthur of his fiduciary duty of non-competition. He could walk his father through the digital treasury portal, show him that the 84 million had not been stolen, but simply moved by its rightful owners to a different advisory firm. The energy required to manage their panic, defend his legal position, and guide them through the ruins of their own office was 94. The energy required to let Richard Sterling read the contracts, let Charles realize the law was not on his side, and let Julian explain to his father why the family's external client base had vanished, required 0. He chose 0. Arthur set the phone back on the oak desk, face down. He slid his thumb over the side button, switching the device to Do Not Disturb, silencing even the vibrations. The room returned to its quiet, sunlit stillness. Outside, down on the main street of Great Barrington, the faint, tinny chime of a church bell marked the half-hour, the sound muffled by the thick, double-paned glass of the windows. He opened his laptop. The screen was clean, showing only his new corporate dashboard for Vance Capital Advisory. In the center of the screen, 3 blue progress bars showed the transition status of his clients' liquid portfolios. The first bar, the Henderson Trust's 42 million, was already at 98%, the assets having cleared the Boston custodian's overnight settlement queue. The second bar, Albright, was at 84%. The third, Curtis, had just begun its liquidation run, the digital ledger showing the steady, silent transfer of 34 million in municipal bonds from the Vance family office's master account to the secure vaults of Loring Private Wealth. With 80 million in assets under management, his new boutique firm's projected annual advisory fee was $640,000. His personal overhead, the rent on this small room above the bookstore, his utilities, and his subscription to the Bloomberg terminal, was $12,000 a year. He was 38 years old, and for the first time in his adult life, his ledger was entirely his own. The door to his small office gave a light, polite knock. "Come in," Arthur said, his voice quiet and level. The door pushed open, and Clara Vance Loring entered. She was wearing her working spectacles, her charcoal wool coat draped over her arm, carrying a small cardboard tray containing 2 cups of black tea from the cafe downstairs. She set one cup on the corner of his oak desk, being careful to avoid the gold-stitched edge of the navy blue blotter. "The Boston custodian just called our compliance desk," Clara said, her voice carrying a quiet, professional satisfaction. "They wanted to verify the signature profile on the Curtis Group's transfer orders. I told them you had personally witnessed the signatures yesterday afternoon." "They were witnessed," Arthur said. "Richard Sterling called my managing partner 10 minutes ago," she continued, leaning her hip against the windowsill, the cold winter light catching the silver frames of her glasses. "He was very polite, but he wanted to know if we would entertain a joint operational agreement to manage the remaining Vance Trust assets. He said your father was prepared to offer you 20% of the holding company's remaining equity if you returned as senior trustee." Arthur picked up his teacup. The steam rose from the dark liquid smelling of bergamot and hot clay. He took a slow, quiet sip, letting the heat settle in his throat. "The remaining Vance Trust assets consist of 400 acres of heavily taxed real estate, an overdrawn operating account, and 90% of the shares in a family holding company that owes $360,000 in transfer taxes by March," Arthur said, his voice as calm and factual as a weather report. Clara looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly behind her spectacles. "So, you told him no?" "I didn't tell him anything, Clara," Arthur said. "I am no longer their administrator. I have no obligation to respond to their inquiries." Clara stood by the window, watching him for a long moment, before a faint, dry smile touched her mouth. She raised her teacup in a silent, quiet toast. "To the new ledger, Arthur," she said. "To the ledger," Arthur murmured. The brass of the new lock cylinder was bright, a raw yellow gold that caught the last dying purple light of the western sky. It looked entirely out of place against the weathered, gray-painted oak of the cottage door, where the wood around the lock plate had been softened by 60 years of Berkshire damp. Arthur held his key between his thumb and forefinger. Insert, press, stop. The key slid in 3/4 of an inch before striking a solid, unyielding wall of brass pin tumblers. It didn't turn. The locksmith had done a clean job. The cylinder was a high-grade Medeco, the kind that required a registered key card to duplicate. The wind coming off the ridge was colder now, carrying the wet, metallic smell of frozen marsh grass from the creek below. A dry pine branch, broken by the morning ice, scraped against the slate roof of the porch with a rhythmic, hollow scritch-scratch. "It's a commercial-grade deadbolt," a voice said from the shadows of the carriage house. Julian stepped out onto the gravel path, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his heavy shearling coat. He had his collar turned up, his chin buried in the wool, his breath rising in a quick, ragged mist. His sports car was idling 50 yards away in the driveway, its exhaust pipe emitting a thick, white plume of condensation that smelled of unburnt fuel and hot oil. He didn't look Arthur in the eye. He looked at the key, still hanging from Arthur's fingers. "Father's orders," Julian said, his voice flat, trying to find that dry, old-money authority that Charles used so easily, but ending up with a thin, defensive vibration instead. Until the Boston accountants finished their review of the capital migrations, we're securing all physical assets on the estate grounds, including the cottage. Arthur did not pull the key out. He let his fingers rest against the cold metal of the brass cylinder. "The cottage is my residence, Julian." "It's on the estate's tax parcel," Julian said, taking a step closer, his boots crunching on the frozen gravel. The structure is registered under the holding company's agricultural assets. You don't have a lease, Arthur. You've never paid rent. I have paid the property taxes on this parcel since 2014, Arthur said, his voice quiet, steady, and entirely free of heat. Using my personal accounts to offset the family's agricultural liability. That was just internal bookkeeping, Julian muttered, his eyes drifting toward the dark woods behind the stables. The holding company owns the dirt. Richard Sterling says, until we establish whether there was a breach of fiduciary duty regarding the Curtis and Henderson portfolios, nothing leaves this property. Your papers, your clothes, Mother's Hermes saddle, it's all under estate seal. Arthur stood on the low stone step of his porch. He made the calculation. Under Massachusetts General Law, Section 27, an unlawful lockout of a residential occupant, even one without a formal lease, carried an automatic treble damages penalty. By physically changing the locks on his residence and seizing his personal effects, including his mother's vintage saddle, which was specifically willed to him in her personal probate filings from 1998, Charles and Julian had committed a clear civil offense. To call the Great Barrington Police Department right now, show them his driver's license with the cottage's address, and force a physical entry would take 45 minutes. It would result in a loud, messy scene in the driveway, with Julian shouting about the family name while the local deputy wrote out a trespass citation. The energy to do that, manage the local gossip, and engage in a petty shouting match was 88. The energy to let them keep the door locked, let the unlawful lockout remains on the record, and hand the case directly to Clara's litigation team in Boston tomorrow morning was 2. He chose 2. Arthur pulled his key from the lock. He slid it back into his pocket, his fingers dry and steady. The Hermes saddle requires a leather preservative every 14 days, Julian, Arthur said, his voice level. If the humidity in the carriage house drops below 40%, the pigskin will shrink around the tree, cracking the seams. Julian blinked, his jaw tightening under his collar. He had expected Arthur to demand the keys. He had expected him to threaten to call the bank, to shout about the legal definitions of tenancy, or to try and push past him to the door. This quiet, dry warning about the humidity in the carriage house caught him entirely off guard, like a rider whose horse had suddenly refused a fence it had cleared a dozen times before. We have staff to handle the tack, Arthur, Julian said, his voice dropping into a defensive whine. Miguel does not clean the Hermes saddle, Arthur said. He knows the leather is too thin for standard saddle soap. Arthur stepped down from the stone porch. He did not look at Julian as he walked past him, down the gravel path toward his old Volvo wagon, which was parked near the boundary gate. His boots made a quiet, clean crunching sound on the frozen mud, a steady, rhythmic cadence that didn't break. "Arthur!" Julian called out behind him, his boots scraping the gravel as he turned to follow. "The Boston office. They're telling Father that the weekly payroll can't clear on Friday unless we have your administrative password to release the local banking draft. The system is asking for a 3-factor verification from your corporate phone." Arthur stopped by the driver's side door of his car. The window glass was covered in a thin, gray sheet of frost that had begun to pattern like fern leaves along the rubber seal. He reached out and cleared a small circle of frost with his gloved thumb, his movements slow and deliberate. "My corporate phone was deactivated at 9:15 this morning, Julian," Arthur said, "along with my administrative login." "Then how do we clear the payroll?" Julian's voice had lost its dry authority entirely now, replaced by a raw, thin panic that the wind carried up toward the ridge. "Miguel and the grooms, they expect their checks on Friday morning. If they don't get paid, they aren't going to turn the horses out. They aren't going to clean the stalls." Arthur opened the car door. The hinges gave a low, dry creak, the grease having frozen in the winter cold. "You have the signature cards, Julian," Arthur said, his voice dropping into the quiet, mechanical hum of the car's idling heater as he started the engine. "You can call the bank manager. He will guide you through the manual reset." "The bank manager is in Boston, Arthur," Julian shouted over the rattle of the old Volvo's diesel engine. "He doesn't answer his cell after 5. Arthur slid into the driver's seat. He closed the door, the heavy metal panel clicking shut with a solid, muffled clunk that cut off the wind and the sound of Julian's voice. Through the frost-rimmed glass of the side window, he saw Julian standing on the gravel path, his hands still deep in his shearling pockets, his face pale and small in the growing dark. He looked like a man who had successfully closed a gate, only to realize he was on the wrong side of the fence. Arthur put the car in gear. He let the clutch out slowly, the tires finding purchase on the icy gravel as he turned the wagon around and drove down the lane, leaving the new brass lock to gleam silently in the dark behind him. The silver pocket watch was a Hamilton from 1938, its heavy, double hunter case engraved with a small, clean monogram of his grandfather's initials, J.A.V. Arthur held it in his palm, his thumb pressing the small brass winding crown. Click, turn, click. He turned the crown slowly, feeling the precise, tiny resistance of the mainspring tightening within its steel housing. It took exactly 16 turns before the resistance became firm, a clean, mechanical stop that indicated the watch was fully wound for the next 24 hours. He closed the case with a soft metallic snip, then laid it on the oak nightstand next to his bed. The room at the Great Barrington Inn was small but warm, the steam radiator in the corner emitting a steady, comforting hush-hush that smelled faintly of old cast iron and distilled water. Outside the window, the yellow glow of the streetlights reflected off the dark, wet slush of the road below, where a light snow had begun to fall again, dusting the hoods of the parked cars in white. Arthur's phone, sitting next to the watch, gave a quiet double buzz. It was a text message from Miguel. "Miguel, Arthur, the barn is freezing. The main water pipe in the wash stalls has started to ice over. Julian came down and told me to plug in 4 old electric space heaters in the hayloft. I told him it's a massive fire hazard with the dry dust, but he won't listen. He's shouting at the grooms. The fuel company says they won't send a truck tonight without a credit card that clears. The horses are shivering, Arthur. Please." Arthur stared at the screen. The blue light cast a cold, pale glow over his fingers. He made the calculation. He had no legal obligation to help. He had resigned. The horses were the property of the Vance family holding company, of which Julian was now the sole agricultural beneficiary. If the water pipes froze and burst, the damage to the 1920s stone barn would be upwards of $50,000. If the horses colicked from drinking ice-cold water, or if the hayloft caught fire from Julian's space heaters, the financial and physical ruin of the estate's primary asset would be total. But Arthur had known these horses since they were foals. He had personally vetted their bloodlines, signed their registration papers, and spent 12 years ensuring their water was warm and their grain was clean. He would not let them freeze or burn because of Julian's desperate, arrogant ignorance. Yet, he would not use his own capital to shield them for free. He opened his laptop, which sat on the small pine desk near the window. He navigated to his legal document templates and pulled up a standard emergency agricultural loan agreement. With quiet, steady fingers, he filled in the blanks. Lender, Arthur Vance. Borrower, Vance Family Holding Company, Equestrian Division. Principal sum, $3,500. Direct payment to Northside Fuel. Interest, 12% per annum. Collateral, first priority possessory lien on the bay mare, registered name, Vance's Legacy, registration number 8841-B. Default clause. In the event of non-payment of the principal and accrued interest within 30 days of this date, legal title and possession of the collateral shall immediately transfer to the lender without further notice or judicial process. Arthur generated the document as a digital PDF with a secure signature link. He then opened a new text message to Miguel. Arthur, tell Julian that I will authorize the immediate emergency delivery of 1,000 gallons of heating oil to the stable block on one condition. He must sign the attached emergency advance agreement on his phone. The moment his digital signature is registered, Northside Fuel will dispatch a truck from the Great Barrington Depot. It will arrive in 45 minutes. He attached the link to the document and pressed Send. The phone remained silent for 3 minutes. Then, the screen began to light up as a series of typing bubbles appeared, vanished, and appeared again. Miguel, he's reading it. He's screaming, Arthur. He says you're trying to steal his horse. Arthur did not reply. He picked up his teacup, taking a slow, quiet sip of the bitter chamomile. He watched the snow outside fall through the yellow cone of the streetlight, the white flakes vanishing the moment they touched the dark, wet asphalt of the road. The phone buzzed again. Miguel, the stallion is shivering now too. The water in his bucket has a skin of ice. Julian is signing. He's crying. 2 seconds later, a system notification popped up on Arthur's laptop screen. Document signed. Emergency Agricultural Advance, Vance Family Holding Company. IP address 24.108.12.92, Vance Guest Cottage. Signature, Julian C. Vance. Arthur's face remained still, his expression showing no more emotion than a printed ledger page. He navigated to his personal bank portal, initiated a direct $3,500 wire to Northside Fuel's commercial clearing account, and attached the emergency authorization code he had kept in his personal files. He then called the private cell number of the Northside Depot manager, a man named Henderson, whom Arthur had paid on time every month for 12 years. Northside, Henderson speaking. Thomas, Arthur said, his voice low and level. It's Arthur Vance. Arthur, the old man's voice warmed instantly. I saw your resignation email this morning. Was wondering when you'd call. The office was in a bit of a state today trying to clear your father's card. The card is frozen, Thomas, Arthur said, but I have just wired $3,500 from my personal account to cover an emergency delivery to the stable block only, not the main house, the stables. The stables only? Henderson paused. Understood. The truck's already loaded for the morning run. But for you, I'll have Joey take it out tonight. He'll be there in 40 minutes. Thank you, Thomas, Arthur said. Ensure he bills the delivery to my private advisory ledger. I'll send the receipt over in the morning. Will do, Arthur. Stay warm. Arthur ended the call. He closed his laptop, the screen going dark, leaving the small room illuminated only by the faint yellow light from the street below. He picked up his grandfather's pocket watch, holding it to his ear. The tiny, dry tick-tick-tick of the brass gears was steady, a rhythmic mechanical pulse that didn't care about the cold, the snow, or the desperate, weeping man 10 miles away in the dark of the carriage house. Julian had his heating oil. The horses would have warm water. and Arthur now held a first-priority legal lien on the only valuable asset remaining in the Vance family stables, a horse that Julian had spent $42,000 of trust money to import, and which would belong entirely to Arthur in exactly 30 days. He closed his eyes, the quiet hum of the radiator filling the room with a steady, suffocating peace. The cast-iron wheel of the manual coffee grinder turned with a heavy metallic crunch. Crack, grind, turn. Arthur held the wooden handle with his right hand, his left hand stabilizing the polished cherry-wood box between his knees. Inside the brass hopper, the dark, oily Sumatra beans resisted the iron teeth before parting with a sharp, dry snap that released a thick, fragrant cloud of roasted carbon, earth, and cedar. He ground exactly 28 grams of coffee, the fine powder falling into the small drawer at the base of the mill with a soft, sliding hiss. He emptied the drawer into the glass beaker of his French press. The morning sun, bright and cold through the east windows of his new office, caught the rising steam as he poured the boiling water from his copper kettle. The dark brown bloom of the coffee rose to the top, foaming slightly, smelling of rich oil and hot glass. The stairs outside his door creaked, not the light, hesitant squeak of the bookstore customers below, but the heavy, dragging tread of a man who was carrying more weight than his knees were designed to support. A light, rhythmic knock followed. "Come in, Richard," Arthur said, without turning his head from the glass beaker. The door pushed open. Richard Sterling stood on the threshold, his wool overcoat damp with melted sleet, his silver hair slightly damp and unkempt. He looked 10 years older than he had on Thursday. He held his leather Gladstone bag in his left hand, but his fingers were trembling slightly, the brass latch clicking against his signet ring with a dry, irregular rattle. He did not look at Arthur. He walked slowly to the small green leather armchair in the corner and sat down, his heavy coat rustling in the quiet room. "The sleet has turned to slush on the highway," Sterling said, his voice a low, dry rasp. He set his bag on the floor between his feet, his hands remaining flat on his knees. The drive down from the estate took nearly an hour. "The tea is black, but I have coffee if you prefer," Arthur said, his hand slowly pressing the silver plunger of the French press down through the dark liquid. The metal mesh resisted the grounds, the oil slicking the glass as the plunger reached the bottom. "Coffee," Sterling murmured. "Black." Arthur poured the dark, steaming liquid into a plain white ceramic mug and set it on the corner of his desk, next to the navy blue leather blotter. He did not sit behind the desk. He remained standing by the window, his hands folded loosely behind his back, his posture as still as the pine trees outside. Sterling picked up the mug. His fingers were spotted with ink, and his wrist was stiff as he lifted the hot clay to his mouth. He took a short, quiet sip, then let out a long, heavy breath that smelled of stale peppermint. "The payroll draft failed at 9:15 this morning, Arthur," Sterling said, his eyes fixed on the dark surface of his coffee. "The bank rejected the master voucher. Miguel and the 3 grooms walked out at 10. They left the stable gates open, but the horses are still in their stalls." "The horses have water," Arthur said. "They do," Sterling nodded slowly. "Julian told me about the emergency oil delivery last night. He said you forced him to sign an advance agreement. He's in a state, Arthur. He's locked himself in the guest cottage. He spent his morning calling his friends in Palm Beach trying to borrow $50,000 to clear the payroll. But, well, the horse world is small. People have already heard about the Devon entry rejection. The old lawyer took another sip of his coffee, the steam condensing on his spectacles. He took them off, using the corner of his tie to wipe the glass, his eyes small and watery without the lenses. "Your father had a spell this morning," Sterling continued, his voice dropping into a quiet, hesitant whisper. "The doctor had to come down from Stockbridge. His blood pressure is through the roof. He's bedridden, Arthur. He spent an hour shouting for you before the sedative took." Arthur watched a single crow land on the snow-covered branch of a maple tree outside the window. The black feathers of the bird were glossy, catching the cold winter light before it shook its wings and flew back toward the ridge. "My resignation was effective yesterday at 9:15, Richard," Arthur said softly. "I know," Sterling said. He put his spectacles back on, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted the wire frames behind his ears. He reached into his Gladstone bag and pulled out a single, legal-sized blue folder. He laid it on the desk blotter, next to his coffee mug. "Your father authorized me to present this to you," Sterling said. "It's a formal restructuring agreement. He is offering to deed the Southern Cottage parcel to you directly, free of any holding company liabilities. He will sign a full, unconditional release of any potential claims regarding the client migrations. And he is prepared to transfer 25% of the voting shares in the Vance family holding company to your personal ledger." Sterling looked at him, his gray eyes carrying a desperate, pleading squint. "All he asks is that you log into the Boston portal, clear the multi-factor verification, and authorize the local payroll draft so we can get the grooms back into the barn. The horses haven't been turned out today, Arthur. If they stay in those stalls without exercise, they're going to start stocking up." Arthur looked at the blue folder sitting on his navy blue blotter. He made the calculation. To accept the 25% voting shares would mean re-entering the holding company's corporate structure. As a major shareholder, he would be legally co-liable for the $360,000 transfer tax coming due in March. He would be co-liable for the holding company's outstanding commercial debt, which currently exceeded $1.2 million. He would be legally bound to manage the estate's insolvency, spending his next 6 months negotiating with creditors, trustees, and tax attorneys to preserve an estate that was already rotting from the inside. The energy required to save his father's pride, manage Julian's debts, and assume co-liability for a bankrupt family legacy was 99. The energy to remain in his quiet, warm office, manage his $80 million in clean client assets, and let the legal consequences of his father's decisions play out naturally was 0. "The holding company is insolvent, Richard," Arthur said. His voice was smooth, quiet, and carried the absolute, unyielding cold of the ice on the window pane. Sterling's hand froze on his coffee mug. "Arthur, the municipal tax draft yesterday left the secondary reserve with exactly $3,212, Arthur continued, his eyes remaining on the maple tree outside. "The weekly stable payroll is $4,200. The quarterly property tax for the main house was $68,000. In March, the IRS will issue a direct assessment for $360,000 for the main timberland transfer tax, which Julian's LLC cannot offset." He turned slowly to look at the old lawyer. "If I accept 25% of the holding company, I accept 25% of that debt. I am an investment advisor, Richard. I do not acquire liabilities." Sterling's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked down at the blue folder, his fingers sliding off the heavy paper as if it had suddenly turned hot. He had represented the Vance family for 50 years, and he had never heard Arthur speak with this level of clinical, mathematical clarity. He had always seen Arthur as the quiet boy who sat in the corner of the library, sorting files while Charles shouted and Julian rode. He had never realized that Arthur was the only one who actually knew what the numbers meant. "They don't have the money to pay the tax, Arthur," Sterling whispered, his voice trembling. "If they can't pay the March assessment, the government will file a tax lien against the main house. They'll auction the land." "Then they will have to liquidate the estate," Arthur said. "And Julian?" Sterling asked, his eyes wide. "What is he going to do? He doesn't know how to do anything else." "Julian has $42,000 worth of custom leather-lined horse transport sitting in Baltimore," Arthur said, his hand reaching for his teacup. "Though he will have to pay the daily storage fees to get it out. And in 28 days, his bay mare will belong to me under the terms of our signed advance agreement." Sterling stared at him, his face pale, his breath rattling in his throat. He realized then, with a cold, absolute certainty, that there would be no negotiation. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no family reconciliation. There was only the quiet, steady pressure of a ledger being balanced. He stood up, his knees cracking in the quiet room. He picked up his Gladstone bag, leaving the blue folder sitting on the desk blotter next to his half-empty mug of cold coffee. "You're a cold man, Arthur," Sterling said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the sleet against the glass. "I am a precise man, Richard," Arthur said. "There is a difference." He watched the old lawyer turn and walk slowly out of the room, his boots heavy and hesitant on the stairs. Arthur did not follow him. He picked up the cold coffee mug, carried it to the small sink in the corner, and washed it clean, wiping the porcelain until it showed nothing but his own hollow reflection. The glass dropper of the inkwell was cool and heavy between Arthur's fingers. He held it over the open mouth of his Mont Blanc fountain pen, slowly squeezing the small rubber bulb at the top. Draw. Drip. Wipe. A single thick bead of midnight blue ink rose into the glass tube, dark and nearly black in the dimming afternoon light. He released the fluid into the pen's reservoir, then used a small square of lint-free linen to wipe the gold-plated nib, removing a tiny, dark smear from the engraved scrollwork. The ink had a faint, sharp scent of vinegar and iron, a clean, acidic smell that vanished the moment he capped the well. Outside, the slush on the street below had frozen into a thick, gray crust of ice. The wind was rising, rattling the metal sign of the bookstore downstairs with a rhythmic, hollow clack-clack that sounded like a loose shutter. A light knock on his door broke the quiet of the office. It wasn't Richard Sterling. This knock was quick, professional, and accompanied by the wet, heavy sound of a plastic poncho sliding against the door frame. "Come in," Arthur said. A young man in a red courier uniform entered, carrying a clipboard in a thick, yellow padded envelope. His boots left 2 gray puddles of melted sleet on the threshold. "Arthur Vance?" the young man asked, his breath smelling of peppermint tobacco. "Yes." "Delivery from the Great Barrington Municipal Office. Certified." The boy held out the clipboard, his thumb pointing to a yellow line marked with a red sticker. "Sign here, please." Arthur took the pen from his pocket, the one he had just filled, and signed his name on the line. A. Vance. The ink was wet, a deep, shining blue that took 3 seconds to settle into the rough paper of the receipt. "Thanks," the boy said. He took the clipboard, dropped the heavy yellow envelope onto the corner of the oak desk, and slipped back out into the hall, his boots squeaking down the wooden stairs. Arthur did not open the envelope immediately. He picked up his linen cloth and wiped his pen once more, ensuring no ink remained on the thread of the cap, before sliding it back into his breast pocket. He then picked up the envelope. It was heavy, sealed with a thick strip of red fiber tape that required a paper cutter to part. He slid his brass letter opener through the seam. Inside were two separate documents. The first was a formal notice from the Great Barrington Building Inspector's Office, addressed to the Resident/Vance Estate, Southern Carriage Cottage. It was a final, non-appealable citation for building code violations. The unpermitted conversion of the carriage house's secondary garage into Julian's private gym and infrared sauna had been flagged during a routine municipal waterline inspection. The citation carried an immediate civil penalty of $12,500 for structural alterations without a certificate of occupancy, along with a formal vacate order for the accessory structure. If the violations were not rectified or the structure returned to its original state as a 3-car storage bay within 30 days, the town would record a priority municipal lien against the entire 400-acre estate parcel. The second document was a certified notification from Boston Trust. Because the Vance family holding company's primary commercial credit line had been frozen due to the unresolved hospitality overdraft, the bank had initiated a cross-collateralization review. Finding that Julian's personal line of credit was secured by his non-voting shares in the agricultural assets, shares that were now valued at near zero due to the frozen timberland proceeds and the empty operating accounts, the bank had officially terminated his personal credit facility. His cards were dead. His overdraft protection was gone. Arthur laid the documents side by side on his navy blue leather blotter, the white paper stark against the dark gold-stitched leather. He made the calculation. He had served on the Great Barrington Planning Board from 2016 to 2022. He knew the building inspector, a man named Miller, very well. He knew that the $12,500 fine could be reduced to a simple $100 filing fee with a single phone call, a retrospective architectural drawing, and a request for a variance hearing. He could draft the variance application in 40 minutes, file it on Monday, and freeze the vacate order before Julian even realized his gym was illegal. The energy to do this, save Julian's gym, and negotiate with Boston Trust to restore his brother's personal line of credit was 92 units of social and financial capital. The energy to fold the documents, slide them into his drawer, and let the town's code enforcement officers march onto the estate grounds on Monday morning was zero. He chose zero. He picked up the Great Barrington code violation notice, placed it inside a fresh manila folder, and wrote a single label on the tab, Pending Estate Encumbrances. He slid the folder into the lower drawer of his oak desk. The drawer slid closed with a quiet, solid shuck, the brass lock clicking into place with a small, clean sound that felt like a gate being bolted from the inside. Arthur's phone, sitting face down on the corner of the desk, gave a single, quiet buzz. It was an email notification from Clara Loring's assistant in Boston. Subject: Curtis Group Transition, confirmed. Arthur, the Boston custodian has completed the final asset transfer for the Curtis Group. $34 million in municipal bonds has cleared our clearing ledger as of 4:15 p.m. The advisory agreements are now fully executed. M. Arthur closed the email. His new firm's total assets under management was now officially $80 million. The liquid transfer was complete. The clients who had funded his father's lifestyle and Julian's horses for 30 years were now entirely his. their capital securely housed in a firm that Charles and Julian could not touch, sue, or borrow from. He looked out the window. The sleet had stopped, replaced by a thick, heavy snow that fell in silent, vertical lines through the gray dusk. The street below was completely white now, the tire tracks of the passing cars vanishing under the fresh powder within minutes. 10 miles away, on the southern boundary of the estate, the stone cottage was dark. The new deadbolt on the gray oak door was cold, its brass cylinder covered in a thin, frozen skin of sleet that would not melt before morning. Inside, his clothes, his books, and his mother's Hermes saddle sat in the unheated rooms, gathering the damp chill of the winter night. They thought they had locked him out. They did not understand that they had actually locked themselves in, trapped in a freezing, bankrupt fortress of their own making, with no fuel, no staff, a $12,000 municipal fine arriving on Monday, and a 40% federal transfer tax waiting for them in March. Arthur stood by the window for another minute, watching the snow accumulate on the brick ledge outside. He picked up his teacup, taking a slow, quiet sip of the bitter chamomile, the heat settling in his chest like a small, warm stone. He was entirely at peace. The small blue flame of the alcohol lamp flickered in the draught, a tiny, hot tongue of violet and orange that cast a restless shadow across the pine table. Arthur held a stick of dark red French sealing wax above the heat, rotating it slowly between his fingertips to ensure the resin melted evenly. Drip, drip, pool. The first drop of hot, thick wax fell onto the parchment of the formal redemption demand letter, followed by another, until a smooth, dark red circle of liquid shellac lay precisely over his signature. It smelled of burnt soot, pine resin, and the dry, medicinal scent of alcohol. Arthur picked up his grandfather's heavy brass desk seal. The metal was cold, its face engraved with the Vance family's old mercantile crest, not the horse under a broken lance that Charles had adopted, but the older, simpler emblem of a balanced scale beneath a single pine tree. He pressed the seal firmly into the center of the hot red wax. Press, hold, release. The wax gave a tiny, dry click as the brass parted from the cooling resin, leaving a perfect, sharp impression of the scale, raised and clear against the dark red background. The phone on his desk did not hum this time. He had disabled Do Not Disturb for only one number, Richard Sterling's private office line. When the screen lit up, Arthur did not hesitate. He slid his thumb across the glass and held the phone to his ear. "Richard," Arthur said, his voice quiet, matching the steady hush-hush of the radiator. "Arthur," the old lawyer's voice came through, but it was no longer a dry, professional rasp. It was thin, paper dry, and carried the trembling, hollow vibration of a man who had spent the night staring into an abyss. "I've spent the last 9 hours in the Boston office. I had my associates pull the original 1996 corporate charter for the Vance Family Holding Company from the state archives." "The blue volume," Arthur said. "Yes," Sterling whispered, a dry cough catching in his throat. "The blue volume. I had forgotten about your grandfather's codicil, the one he insisted on inserting before he signed the primary asset transfer to your father." "Section 12, paragraph 4, Arthur said, his fingers gently brushing a tiny fleck of dried red wax from the brass seal. "The mandatory redemption clause," Sterling said, his voice dropping into a desperate, pleading cadence. "Arthur, if you file that demand, the corporation is legally obligated to redeem your 10% non-voting share at its current appraised physical asset value. In cash, within 48 hours of service. "That is the covenant, Richard," Arthur said softly. "But we don't have the cash, Arthur," Sterling's voice cracked, rising in a sudden, sharp panic that was instantly swallowed by the quiet of the office. "The holding company's liquid reserves are empty. To raise $7.2 million in 48 hours, it's legally impossible without a fire sale. We would have to sell the main house. We would have to liquidate the stables, the equipment, the land trust parcels, everything. The receivership would be automatic. The court would take control of the gates by Tuesday." Arthur looked at the red wax seal on the document before him. The scales of the emblem were perfectly balanced, the lines of the engraving sharp and clean in the morning light. He made the calculation. He could withhold the filing. He could allow his father and brother to scramble, to try and raise the $360,000 for the March tax bill through some high-interest commercial loan that would slowly bleed the remaining equity of the estate over the next 5 years. He could watch them suffer through a slow, agonizing decline, enduring their constant phone calls, their desperate legal threats, and their weaponized incompetence until the estate eventually collapsed under its own weight anyway. The energy to manage a 5-year family decline, defend against their inevitable lawsuits, and keep his own name associated with their rotting legacy was 98. The energy to press the seal, hand the document to the court courier today, and let the automatic receivership dismantle the holding company within 48 hours was 0. He chose 0. "My grandfather did not trust my father's management, Richard," Arthur said, his voice smooth and empty of any malice. "That is why he inserted the clause. He knew that if I were ever removed from the administration of the estate, the holding company would not survive. The 10% redemption was designed as a safety valve, to protect my share of the capital before the machine could destroy itself. But your father," Sterling's voice was barely a whisper now, the sound of an old man whose world was dissolving into paper. "He will be on the street, Arthur. He is 74. He won't survive a public auction of the house. He won't survive the papers. My father has Julian's cottage," Arthur said, "though he will have to resolve the zoning violations before they can occupy the gym. The town's vacate order is effective on Monday." Sterling was silent for 5 seconds. The only sound over the line was the dry, rhythmic rattle of his breathing, a slow, mechanical wheeze that matched the clicking of the grandfather clock 10 miles away. "You've planned this," Sterling said, his voice flat with the realization of his own failure. "For years. Every document you signed, every tax offset you filed, you were setting the boundaries." "I did not plan their decisions, Richard," Arthur said. "I did not freeze the credit line. I did not throw the signature cards into the wastebasket. I did not build an illegal gym. I merely stopped preventing the consequences of those decisions." He did not wait for the lawyer's reply. He ended the call, slid the phone back into his pocket, and folded the parchment document into 3 exact equal parts. He slid the folded paper into a heavy manila envelope, sealed the flap with a strip of linen tape, and wrote the address of the Suffolk County Probate Court on the front in his neat block print. He picked up his brass desk seal, wrapped it in a clean square of chamois cloth, and placed it inside his leather briefcase, next to the folders for the Henderson Trust, the Albright Foundation, and the Curtis Group. The capital strike was complete. He stood by the window and looked out at the street. The snow had stopped falling, leaving Great Barrington buried in a deep, clean white that muffled the sound of the passing cars. The sky was a pale, hard blue, the sun reflecting off the icy roofs with a brilliant, blinding glare that left no shadows on the road. He was 38 years old. He had $80 million in clean, loyal assets under his direct management. He had his grandfather's pocket watch, his mother's vintage Hermes saddle, and by Monday afternoon, his brother's champion mare would belong to him under a priority legal lien. Arthur Vance picked up his leather briefcase, his fingers dry and steady against the cold brass handle. He turned off the desk lamp, walked out of the room, and closed the door behind him with a quiet, final click that echoed through the empty stairs like the snapping of a lock. The air in early March had lost its frozen, brittle edge, replacing it with the heavy, sour smell of wet earth and rotting pine needles. The snow along the driveway of the Vance estate had melted into gray, porous heaps, revealing the gravel beneath, not the pristine, white, crushed limestone Arthur had maintained, but a muddy, rutted track littered with broken birch twigs and plastic feed bags that had blown out of the dumpster. Arthur stood by the open back of his Volvo wagon, his boots sinking 2 inches into the soft clay of the shoulder. Lift, place, align. He lifted his mother's vintage Hermes saddle from the wooden rack the movers had brought out from the cottage. The pigskin was supple, dark, and completely free of mold, its leather smelling faintly of the neatsfoot oil he had applied months ago. He slid it into the custom-fit canvas bag, zipped the heavy brass teeth closed, and laid it gently on the rubber mat in the back of his car. The court-appointed receiver, a quiet woman in a dark windbreaker carrying a clipboard, stood near the cottage door. She was applying a heavy orange paper seal across the seam of the Medico deadbolt. The seal was marked with the bold black letters of the Massachusetts Probate Court. Secured. Do not enter. A shadow fell across the gravel path. Julian walked slowly down from the guest cottage. He was no longer wearing his custom riding boots or his tailored wool coats. He wore a faded, oversized canvas jacket that looked as if it belonged to one of the former stable hands, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets, his shoulders hunched against the damp wind. His hair was long, untrimmed, and his jaw was covered in a patchy, uneven growth of silver and gray stubble. He stopped 10 yards away, his boots making a wet, heavy squelch in the mud. He did not look at the court receiver. He looked at the Hermes saddle in the back of Arthur's car. "They're taking the main house next month," Julian said. His voice was low, flat, and stripped of the airy, arrogant drawl that had once filled the library. "The auction is scheduled for April 12th. Richard Sterling says we have 30 days to clear out the furniture." Arthur did not stop his hands. He took a heavy leather bridle, wrapped the reins tightly around the brow band, and placed it in a small wooden crate near the rear bumper. "The auction is a matter of public record, Julian." "Father's in a facility in Great Barrington," Julian continued, his eyes drifting to the orange court seal on the cottage door. He doesn't really know where he is. He keeps asking when the timberland wire is going to clear. He thinks we're still going to Wellington." Arthur did not answer. He closed the tailgate of his wagon, the heavy metal door shutting with a solid, muffled clunk that seemed to settle the quiet of the yard. "What about the mare?" Julian asked, his voice dropping into a desperate, hollow whisper. "The 30 days on your advance agreement ended on Monday. The bank said her registration was transferred to your name yesterday." Arthur leaned his hip against the bumper of his car, his gloved hands sliding into his pockets. He looked past Julian toward the empty, silent stable block, where the copper cupolas were already beginning to turn a dark, neglected green in the damp spring air. "She has been sold," Arthur said. Julian's chest tightened, his jaw working as if he wanted to shout, to demand, to use the weight of a name that no longer carried any currency in the valley. "Who bought her? Which stable? If she's going to New York, I still have contacts there. I could help train her. I could. She was sold to Thomas Henderson's granddaughter, Arthur said. His voice was level, calm, and carried the absolute, unyielding clarity of a settled account. Julian froze. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. Henderson? Thomas Henderson doesn't have a show barn. He doesn't even have a trainer on staff. She is not a show horse anymore, Julian, Arthur said softly. The vet in New Jersey examined her hock. The localized swelling had turned into chronic arthritis because she was worked over poles while unsound. She cannot jump again. Julian stared at him, his face pale and small in the gray afternoon light. So, what is she doing? She is a schoolmaster, Arthur said. She will spend her days walking the flat pasture with a 9-year-old girl. Her joints will rest. Her feed will be standard Timothy and oats. She will not require German supplements. Julian let out a dry, rattling breath that sounded like dry leaves scraping across a stone floor. He looked down at his mud-caked boots, his fingers twitching inside his pockets. The horse he had spent $42,000 of trust money to import. The animal he had pinned his entire career, his reputation, and his father's vanity on, was now nothing more than a pasture pet for the grandchild of the client he had lost. The entire Vance legacy, once so loud, so demanding, and so heavy, had been reduced to a quiet walk in a flat field. "You didn't have to do it this way," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "You could have helped us. You could have saved the estate." "I saved my share, Julian," Arthur said. "The rest was your program." He walked to the driver's side door, opened it, and slid into the warm, quiet interior of the Volvo. He started the engine, the low, steady hum of the diesel motor filling the yard as he put the car in gear. He did not look back at the cottage, or the main house, or his brother standing alone in the muddy gravel. He drove slowly down the lane, the tires finding easy purchase on the wet gravel, leaving the ruts and the rot of the old estate behind him in the dark. The world does not run on noise. It does not survive on presence or vanity or the social weight of an old name. It runs on the quiet, invisible labor of those who keep the gears greased, who balance the ledgers in the dark, and who know exactly when to walk away before the bridge begins to crack. Every action has its ledger. Every debt is eventually called. And when the silence finally settles, only the balanced accounts remain. Thank you for listening to this presentation on Crazy Karma Stories. The gears of justice turn slowly, but they grind with absolute mathematical precision. If you found a deep, quiet satisfaction in the steady balance of Arthur's ledger, and if you believe that every silent action eventually bears its weight, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your presence here is the quiet force that keeps our ledger balanced. Until the next account is settled, keep your records clean, and remember, karma never misses a payment.